Hello, and welcome. My name is Denise Davis, and in addition to being a senior lecturer in gender and sexuality studies here at Brown, I have the good fortune to serve, along with Elizabeth Weed, Ellen Rooney, and Elizabeth Wilson, as a co-editor of Differences, a journal of feminist cultural studies, which is published with Duke University Press and housed here at the Pembroke Center. On behalf of the editors, I'd like to extend heartfelt thanks to the Pembroke Center staff, Donna Goodnow and Diane Straker. For all the work that went into organizing this event, and to my colleagues Hella Sick and Wendy Lee for their steadfast support. I would also like to acknowledge the work of our graduate proctors, Abigail Culpepper, Tara Holman, Scott Jack Shaw, and Harper Shallow, whose contributions in the editorial office are invaluable. We are especially grateful to Pembroke Center Director Leela Gandhi for championing the journal. Differences published its first issue, titled Life and Death in Sexuality, Reproductive Technologies and AIDS, in 1989. The journal was the brainchild of co-founding editors Naomi Shore and Elizabeth Weed, who set out to establish a forum for feminist critique as a practice of unsettling doxa and questioning the foundational assumptions anchoring such recently established fields as women's studies and queer studies. The journal remains committed to analyses that offer not so much settled answers or interpretations as questions that resist closure and readings that provoke us to rethink and reread. Last year, in the spirit of exploring epistemological structures that condition, limit, and thwart meaning-making, we hosted a colloquium called Limits of Legibility, Questions of Blackness and Sexuality, where guests considered sexual difference and blackness not so much as cultural identities as structuring negativities. Today's program, the second of what we hope will be an annual Limits of Legibility colloquium, considers the often disavowed, often transhistorical humanist assumptions that form the bedrock of so many intellectual currents in what have come to be called the environmental humanities. Just as any notion of sex itself obscures the many meanings imputed to sex, so we must interrogate the positing of life itself, Linhofer has written, as the metaphysical ground of our ethics. Emphasizing vitalist intertwinings, affective and speculative modes, and fantasies of decentering the anthropos, which is at once posited and refused, much current scholarship and pedagogy, in spite of its concern with care and aspiration to think otherwise, has so optimistically embraced reciprocal inter- and intra-species entanglements that causal relations have been occluded and differential distributions of power, resources, and responsibility are minimized, abstracted and conceptualized, or transformed into aesthetic practices. As Jean-Thomas Tremblay has observed, and I quote, "An eco-critical we is impossible in a sociological sense, for there may be an existential condition proper to climate catastrophe, but there is no universal experience of said condition." Moreover, as Dixa Ramirez de Oleo has pointed out, an idealistic focus on generativity risks ignoring the racial antagonisms in which relationality is grounded. She writes, "What looks like relation from one perspective is parasitism from another." Similarly, Axel Carrera has critiqued, and I quote, "problematic kinds of correlationism and vitalism that hinder the possibility of thinking concretely about anti-Black racism." We're here today to have a critical conversation. There's no assumption that everyone on the panel or in the room share any method or belief, or starts from any particular foundational axiom, though I think it's safe to say that we all share a propensity for symptomatic reading. We're here not to come to consensus or agreement, but to think together with and against each other. Our moderator today will be Elizabeth A. Wilson, Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Emory University, and a co-editor of Differences as of a year. As a scholar of feminist science studies, her work brings together psychoanalytic theory, affect theory, feminist and queer theory, and neurobiology. She has held fellowships at Princeton University, at the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. Professor Wilson is the author of several books that have pushed feminist theorists to account for the physical processes in psychic experience. Most recently, a Sylvan Tompkins handbook, Foundations for Affect Theory, co-authored with Professor Adam Frank. She is currently undertaking archival research on Valerie Solanas and the politics of anger and pathology in feminist theory, a project that you can read about in her newly published article, Corroded with Scum, Valerie Solanas' Theories of Mind, which appears in the spring 2025 issue of Critical Inquiry. The monograph will be structured as a series of small, digitally enhanced chapters aimed at an interdisciplinary readership. Please join me in warmly welcoming Elizabeth Wilson.
Thank you so much, Denise. Lovely to see you all. Let me, before I introduce our first speaker, give you some idea of our schedule today. The speakers will be in the order that they are sitting. So we will begin with Dr. Tremblay, and then Dr. Ramirez-Dolio, then Drs. Carrera and Huffer. There will be a 15-minute break at the halfway mark. Each paper is about 30 minutes long. There will be 15 minutes of discussion, Q&A, after each paper, and I will introduce each speaker as we go along. At the end, we'll have an open 30-minute discussion for the whole floor, and following that, a reception, and we'll be done at 6 o'clock. So, great to see you all here today. Let me start with our first speaker, Jean-Thomas Tremblay, who is an Associate Professor of Environmental Humanities and is the Director of the Graduate Program in Social and Political Thought at York University. His research spans the environmental humanities, sexuality studies, literary studies, and film studies. This work concentrates on the overlapping environmental, economic, and political crises of the 1970s to the present, while at the same time recovering the longer histories of nature writing and the life sciences. His first monograph was Breathing Aesthetics, Duke University Press in 2022. This book investigates aesthetic responses to the crisis in breathing that is marked by the intensified pollution, weaponization, and monetization of the air. His second monograph, Negative Life, The Cinema of Extinction, was published by Northwestern University Press in 2024 and was co-authored with Stephen Swarbrick. This book interrogates the pedagogical and moral duty with which eco-critics and environmental humanists more broadly tend to entrust representations of nature. Jean-Thomas' current solo book project is tentatively titled To Mean the World, Climate Action, Liberal Catastrophe. This project seeks to detach environmentalism from a liberal project of sense-making and has been partially funded by an SSHRC Insight Development Grant. The first two excerpts from this project have been published. The first in the fall 2024 issue of Critical Inquiry called Just Sabotage, and the second in the current winter 2025 issue of Representations, and that paper is called Enemies of the People. Dr. Tremblay's paper today is titled Calamity as Defacement. Calamity as Defacement. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm truly delighted to be here. I'm grateful to too many people to name, but I do wish to extend special thanks to Elizabeth Wilson for the generous invitation and the Pembroke Center for this wonderful hospitality. So I began considering this symposium's inceptive question, that of the sexual and racial antagonisms too often patched over by ecological thoughts, ethics of entanglement or enmeshment, in my first book, Breeding Aesthetics. I then did so more vigorously and extensively with my collaborator Stephen Swarbrick in Negative Life, the Cinema of Extinction. Our titular concept of negative life names the formalization and materialization by film of life's heightened contradictions amid the 6 mass species extinction. Encounters with negative life are precipitated by specimens of disaster, eco-horror, and transcendental cinema, whose deflagrated pastorals prohibit characters and spectators from accessing a horizon of harmonious co-living. These films locate in encounters with the natural world, not the plenitude of interspecies wisdom, but a gap in signification or an apedagogical drive. To read aesthetic objects against eco-criticism's customary pedagogical schemes is not to free oneself nihilistically from the pressures of learning anything. It is instead to take seriously the duty of learning what one does not already know. In a monograph in progress, I contend with the reduction of stories to the task of raising awareness or consciousness by both present-day environmentalism and the environmental humanities. The eco-citizen produced by such an aesthetic education achieves legibility within a liberal humanist framework whose operation as a regime of violence and exclusion has been crucially exposed by Black and feminist critics of sentimentality. I carry 2 aims, the success of which relies on a betrayal of content by form in aesthetic cases issued mainly from a contemporary corpus that spans the literary, cinematic, and dramatic arts. The first aim is to untether environmental or climate action from a liberal edict of sense or meaning-making. The second is to articulate a fractured critical genealogy that from post-Kantian thought to psychoanalysis to deconstruction to metabolic Marxism to Afro-pessimism resists an imperative to endorse the given world and its expansionist, colonial, and imperial status quo. This project necessitates what, among other things, I call, after Paul Deman and Elizabeth Povinelli, an imminent critique of the rhetoric of late liberalism. And by the rhetoric of late liberalism, I mean the set of discursive and legal processes that manage catastrophe and extinction in settler and extractive societies. So I'll be devoting the bulk of my remarks to modeling this critique. And what follows is in 3 parts, and it is titled Calamity as Defacement. Part 1. To give voice to or to put a face on ecological doom, peri-apocalyptic prosopopeia is the defining trope of late liberalism. It is found in the vicinity of allochronic, pre- and post-apocalyptic expressions, say that catastrophic events would be unprecedented and that the world has already ended. Povinelli submits late liberalism, a parodizing gesture more than a homogenizing strategy, to refer to the reproduction of the settler and extractive state through the geontological governance of markets and differences, notably the difference between the lively and the inert. In this account, hierarchies are secured by discourses that transgress the distinction between the living and the non-living, the growing and the receding, even in the name of naturalizing each category as discrete and stable. Not only does prosopopeia proliferate under late liberalism, in law, in culture, in the scholarship on both, but the tropes and the order's operations mimic each other. This rhetorical device, above all others, locates within the interchange between the animate and the inanimate the labor of figuration, the generation of shapes and positions, and of a world to contain them through deviation and disruption. Whereas Frederick Jameson holds that the disappearance of personification signals the emergence of modernity, indeed that personification's play with fixed substances and entities has given way to allegories' kinship between processes, I propose that late liberalism signals the unfinished business of personification and its penchant for the caricatural or the stereotypical. I do this when I offer a direct quote. An affiliation between late liberalism and prosopopeia is implied when Povinelli identifies 3 tools, symptoms, figures, and diagnostics of this mode of governance: the desert, the animist, and the virus. The desert promises the return of extinct life through the management of knowledges. The animist assures that life is never truly gone insofar as all matter is imbued with vitality. And the virus confuses the arrangements of existence to replicate itself. All 3 figures and their attendant imaginaries, respectively carbon, the indigene, and the terrorist, entail some personification, some ascription of human traits to non-human entities and processes. The desert, the animus, and the virus amount for Povinelli to governing ghosts who exist in relation to two worlds in late liberalism. The world in which the dependent opposition of life, bios, and death, thanatos, and of life, bios, and non-life, geos, meteoros, are sensible and dramatic, and the world in which these enclosures are no longer or have never been relevant, sensible, or practical. Povinelli's world-crossing specters expand late liberalism's prosopopeal repertoire beyond the Anthropocene concept, which fits a human mask onto the modulation of life and non-life down to geological substrata. A ruminous feedback loop presents human life as the afterlife of the human, a figure of expansion that merges Sylvia Wynter's theocentric men 1 and ratiocentric men 2. Claire Colebrook caricatures the stratigraphy of the Anthropocene in an epistolary register, as a letter from the past, a mark on the earth indicating that beings have had an impact. The reception of that letter as a prompt to situate humanity historically and to alter that species' trajectory, Colebrook clarifies elsewhere, requires a transcendental subject or formal omniscient narrator. We direct an interpretive eye at various worlds that contributed to or suffered from the journey of an anthropos who arrives at the present of self-recognition. Confining non-subjective planetary transformations to a subject occasions a psychotic, as in delusory or worldless, self-reflexivity. The human thinks through and differentiates itself from natural and human histories, both of which it recapitulates, according to the first of Dipesh Chakrabarty's influential theses on the planetary crisis of climate change. In salvaging an educated and invigorated subject of historical actuality from the rubble of a modernity project pinned on that very subject, the Anthropocene concept, notes your own Jacques Calipe, figures the felicitous simultaneously of man and anachronism. Calipe explains, paradoxically, our disruptive impact also falls in line with and parallels the out-of-jointness of our thought, since the anthropos tropes thinking as a capacity for self-differentiation and disjunction. So prosopopeia occupies the domains of thought and non-thought, the worlds of the living and the non-living. Its animation or reanimation is dragged down by a death-bound heaviness. These paradoxes evince a deconstructive approach to the rhetorical device, one largely indebted to de Man in his 1979 essay, Autobiography as Defacement. De Manian autobiography corresponds to the moment of alignment between the two subjects involved in the process of reading, in which they determine each other by mutual reflexive substitution. This specular structure may be most explicit when authors proclaim themselves the subjects of their own understanding, but it is upheld whenever a text is attributed to someone and considered legible through that attribution. In a reading of William Wordsworth's essays upon epitaphs and their claim for restoration in the face of death, de Man links autobiography to the epitaph on the basis that both rely on the fiction of the voice from beyond the grave to personify an absence. Autobiography as Defacement reaches two foremost conclusions. First, the structurally intersubjective rhetorical function of prosopopeia as positing voice or face by means of language discloses that we subjects lack not life per se, but the shape and the sense of a world accessible only in the privative way of understanding. And second, death is a displaced name for a linguistic predicament, and the restoration of mortality by autobiography, the prosopopeia of the voice and the name, deprives and disfigures to the precise extent that it restores. Autobiography veils the defacement of the mind of which it is itself the cause. De Man's insistence that autobiography designates a figure of reading or of understanding that occurs to some degree in all texts, which is to say, per deconstruction's customary inversion, in none, has been heard by scholars who've contributed to a general theory of prosopopeia, one that exceeds the corpuses of life writing and romanticism. My remarks won't be consistently deconstructive, but I will be reading for the coincidence of revelation and its insufficiency or impossibility. I take the tradition seriously for its relevance to anti-imperial critique, for what it's taught us about the arbitrariness of signs, and for its account of various apocalypses, including, as we shall soon see, the nuclear kind. And I do this in addition to extending textuality to Catalan filmmaker Albert Serra's film Pacifiction from 2022. Set on or around the island of Tahiti in French Polynesia, the film follows de Roller, played by Benoît Magimel, the High Commissioner of the Republic, amid sightings of a mysterious submarine in the harbor and rumors that France is about to resume its nuclear tests at great environmental and human cost. Surrounding Magimel is an ensemble cast that comprises Marc Suzini as the French admiral who parrots France's delusions of nuclear grandeur, and Paoa Mahagafanao as Shana, a shrewd hospitality and sex worker turned political aide and confidant. Pacifiction relays Jacques Derrida's insight from a 1984 piece that nuclear weapons are fabulously textual. Derrida justifies his claim by remarking that for the moment, a nuclear war has not taken place. One can only talk and write about it. Much is whispered and drafted, especially in scenes where Serra's generically restless film verges on the paranoid thriller, about events that have yet to happen, or more accurately, about events that have not very recently happened. Between 1966 and 1996, France conducted between 175 and 181 nuclear tests in French Polynesia. Derrida's claim regarding the bomb's fabulous textuality holds true, given the sheer number of preventative and deterrent treaties and arrangements it has generated in the world of pacifiction as in our own. However, Derrida's justification is valid only if we consider war categorically distinct from the violence of establishing and consolidating what Jessica Hurley calls the infrastructure of nuclear colonialism and imperialism. There are other ways that pacifiction invites deconstructive attention. Serra's reputation as a festival darling who blurs the line between narrative and essay cinema poses the question of how much a collectively made and technologically mediated work can bear the signature of its auteur. Pacifiction's very title resembles deconstruction's neologisms. The portmanteau of Pacific and fiction presents the Pacific Islands as an object of narrative and financial speculation, as well as the material onto which French myths of military might and world historical significance can be written and rewritten. These are the elements of the white mythology that Derrida defines as a metaphysics which has effaced in itself that fabulous scene which brought it into being and which yet remains active and stirring, inscribed in white ink, an invisible drawing covered over in the palimpsest. The film also looks as though its title has dropped a letter, an A. Pacification, which we might hallucinate by reading pacifiction too hastily, evokes the brutal reinforcement of peace, the reassurances, the pieties, and the blackmail that neutralize anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and anti-war or pacifist struggle. And yet what makes pacifiction a valuable case study is more than its ready-made affinities with deconstruction, its problematization of prosopopoeia's representational function in mending and by the same token cleaving a late liberal existence marked by the multiplicity and collapse of forms of the event, such as the event of extinction. Serra's film magnifies a certain abrasion in the sublimation of figuration as disfiguration. No, excuse me. It magnifies a certain abrasion in the sublimation of disfiguration as figuration. Ghost-like and grotesque characters appear either too individuated or not individuated enough, silhouetted against crepuscular backdrops or blended with neon-lit surroundings. Such characters are tasked with granting faces and voices to paradoxical ideas about environmental and social collapse. One couldn't die and yet can't not have died. The world couldn't end and yet can't not have ended. Pacifiction's prosopopoeiae recall, beyond the poetic realm, the distortion or disfigurement that Anaïde Narcissian names the calamity form, one that is firmly impersonal for it signals the reception and circulation of disaster as no one's fault, or alternatively, as the fault of an ideology rather than an agent, entity, or process. The clash between impersonal form and individual subjectivity reveals as illusory the personhood and personality that prosopopoeia inevitably brings about through non-privative means. This artifice is most striking when pacifiction denaturalizes the brutal mechanisms through which combinations of particularities and differences, such as the figure of the racialized and transfeminized sex worker embodied by Shana, are made to signify global destitution. Part 2. Popular and scholarly accounts of nuclear challenges to thought and thinkability have shared a governing idiom, the sublime. Francis Ferguson establishes so in the same blockbuster 1984 issue of Diacritics that also comprises Derrida's meditation on the bomb's fabulous textuality. Because their consequences defy spatial and temporal measures, nuclear explosions can be thought only as total, and totality is hard to think. To encounter the sublime, that alternative and counterpoint to the beautiful, is thus to think the unthinkable, to exist in one's non-existence. Ferguson observes that the sublime exceeds our cognition of natural objects, but shapes subjectivity and consciousness. Indeed, that it is increasingly enlisted in the search for a unique and individual subjectivity, a personal and personalized consciousness. A treatise like Jonathan Schell's 1982 The Fate of the Earth refers to future generations, the unborn, to justify nuclear disarmament in terms of, as Ferguson puts it, an appeal to consciousness that is always figured as a privileged object because of its non-existence. In the nuclear era, one excavates the romantic artifact of the sublime, both to register the foreclosure of human life and to gain the affective momentum necessary to imagine transcending such foreclosure. And yet, Ferguson concludes, the claustrophobia evaded by the thought of marching off into a future free from nuclear peril, a future that belongs not to us but to the unborn, is mainly that inspired by the pressures of intersubjectivity, or of being totally conditioned by being surrounded by other consciousnesses. Ferguson, though this isn't explicitly her aim, captures a key dynamic of peri-apocalyptic prosopopeia. Discourses of nuclear deterrence and disarmament summon consciousness and conscience from their extinction. We imagine ourselves dead or other people not born or born without a future to take positions in the present that confirm our pedigree as thinking and thoughtful subjects. In Pacifiction, the Admiral brings forth the nuclear sublime when he promises destruction on an inconceivable scale. His interlocutors appear unable to cognize this promise or to take it at face value, but some seize the opportunity supplied by the nuclear sublime to project themselves into a future of total devastation from which they can advocate caution in the present. Pacifiction begins with the Admiral's arrival in Tahiti and ends with his departure. The opening drone shot, which you can see, it's quite impersonal, the reception and circulation of disaster as the fault of an ideology, dixit Narcissian, and it surveys a massive port with tall cranes and countless shipping containers. Behind the port are the Pacific Ocean and further still sharp mountain peaks, lilac against the rust-colored sky. The next shot too occurs at dawn or dusk. Much of the film is suspended in time and unfolds in the middle space. A boat, as you'll see in a few seconds, carries the Admiral standing and a small crew of Marines all sitting as it glides quietly toward a dock lined with palm trees. Muffled instructions can be overheard, but it's the pleasant sound of the waves that prevails. The Admiral and his crew head over to the club Paradise Night, colloquially known as Morton's after his proprietor. Surrounded by employees in revealing white swimsuits, de Roller tells the Admiral that women have allegedly visited the Admiral's submarine. Women and girls in Serra's film often euphemize sex workers. Men and guys, for their part, euphemize soldiers or, again, sex workers. The Admiral replies that there are no limits to happiness, hinting at the existence of the submarine, the presence of sex workers aboard, and the libidinal character of military occupation all at once. I like hearing this lighthearted tone, Admiral, says de Roller, to diffuse tension before the pair agree that one ought, above all, to maintain such a tone. These kinds of pleasantries are echoed in a later scene, wherein the Admiral tells de Roller, I give you my word, all will go well. Nearby, two people are practicing autoerotic asphyxiation as if miming the French official's conversion of an existential threat into an agreeable transaction. De Roller serves as the French Republic's emissary, aware only of what very little information the government of France deems suitable to his office. He relies on gossip, amid which he and others acutely registers the pressures of intersubjectivity described by Ferguson. To prevent an upheaval and to secure his fragile authority, de Roller urges temperance with the Tahitian population. When echoes from an island where nuclear tests took place in prior years are reported, and projects to restructure the Center for Nuclear Experimentation are brought up, de Roller reassures that while one ought to anticipate and act preemptively, it would be unthinkable, financially and ethically, to reactivate such a machine. So de Roller's rejoinder to speculations about the resumption of nuclear tests, which is to say his case for calm in the present, excludes from the realm of thought the expansion of an infrastructure of colonial violence and imperial force, the very infrastructure of which the High Commissioner's presence in Tahiti is a relic and always also a presage. Pacifiction's concluding minutes, which proceed from the club to the motorboat, flip the opening. Around twilight, we return to the dock where the Admiral and his crew step onto the motorboat and depart much faster this time. De Roller leans on a fence and watches them go. A cloud formation reminiscent of the emblematic mushroom cloud hovers above a mountain, as you can see in the distance. The landscape also recalls the mural painting of a volcanic eruption that backgrounds most scenes at Paradise Night. It is dark when the Admiral, no longer loopy, delivers an impassioned speech to his crew. I'm just going to skip a little bit.
Écoutez-moi, messieurs, nous partons aujourd'hui pour les îles. Nous ne reviendrons pas. Délestez-vous de tout ce qui vous retient ici. Nous allons chercher les derniers ingénieurs qui sont indispensables à l'accomplissement de notre mission. Tout a été préparé. Le premier tir aura lieu à l'aube. Le premier depuis 20 ans. 20 ans que nous attendons de nous hisser à la hauteur des grandes puissances. Nous leur ferons craindre le pire. Il faut du courage pour ce que vous vous apprêtez à faire. Oui, du courage et du cœur. Et vous en avez. Vous craignez nos propres publics, mais ne vous inquiétez pas. Là où nous allons, personne ne vous reconnaîtra, car personne n'est au courant de notre mission. Nous avons déjà fait l'erreur de croire, il y a 20 ans, qu'ils comprendraient ce qu'est le sacrifice. Seuls ceux qui doivent nous craindre verront ce dont nous sommes capables. Un jour peut-être, d'autres reconnaîtront votre œuvre. Et ce jour-là, le monde aura changé.
So the Admiral mobilizes the future perfect, or futur antérieur in French, toward what Brian Musumi, in the context of the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq, calls the future birth of the affective fact, the subsumption of the present under a future of self-renewing menace potential. That the world will have changed both explains and justifies the present making of the Anthropocene. The sinister, non-melodic electronic music couldn't be further from the orchestral crescendo that in military dramas typically accompanies rousing speeches like the Admiral's. His address is so jarring in its over-promotion of sacrifice, the sacrifice of colonial violence, and so at odds with the ambient score, as to sound implausible. The bewilderment that this final scene invites, various characters have modeled throughout Pacifiction. Other than de Roller, let us know the Maui leader, Matahi, played by Matahi Pembroke. Matahi struggles to take the Admiral at his word when the latter announces at Paradise Night, one must send clear signals, strong ones, conspicuous ones. When they see what we're willing to do to our people, yes, our own, will they still be able to doubt what awaits our enemies? And I'll return to this logic of possession, our own, both us and ours, in the next section, which will be the final one. Matahi wonders if the French armed forces, here personified by the Admiral, will have the courage to publicize their plans, and the Admiral's response is enthusiastic. With great fanfare, we'll announce it with great fanfare. We'll stand by it, I'll stand by it. Matahi looks in disbelief at the Admiral, who, projecting what Rachel calls the terrorism of so-called deterrent weaponry onto the world that bears this weaponry's scars, escalates. What do you do with the terrorists? What do you do with the terrorisms, diverse and varied? Matahi deflects the Admiral's death threats, volunteering that alcohol might have induced paranoia and maintaining that Polynesians have no enemies. By ascribing paranoia to the Admiral, Matahi himself inhabits a kind of meta-paranoia, not so much the suspicion that a threat is being hidden, as the suspicion that a threat's disclosure is a bluff, that it somehow hides the absence of a threat. De Roller misreads the Admiral's intent to destroy and kill as banter, and Matahi misreads it as drunken confusion. Both seek to exclude the nuclear from serious reflection and regular cognition. Both, that is, seek to diffuse the ways in Chow's influential formula, the world, planet Earth, and the island as world, is made into a target, an object to be destroyed, and the boundary between war and peace is semiotically blurred. The problem of nuclear unthinkability has to do for Chow not with sublimity, but with self-referentiality. Nuclear proliferation causes itself whether as aggression, Masumi's future birth of the affective fact, or as Chow argues, in the form of deterrence. The Admiral lends his face and voice to a guarantee of extinction against which his interlocutors attempt impossibly to ensure themselves. Insofar as calamity is here ideological and libidinal, the discourses that usher it are not exclusive to the Admiral. Others can and do fashion themselves as personifications of nuclear colonialism and imperialism, or subjects for whom thinking encompasses the unthinkable. There we go. Lastly, part 3. Past Fiction isn't a film about Polynesia or Polynesians. It doesn't purport to reveal anything about the experiences of that population. Serra veers from an eco-critical vision of allegorical repair by reliably adopting the point of view of European characters and making no obvious attempt to supplement it with indigenous or post-colonial knowledges. One binocular shot renders de Roller's field of vision as he spies on the submarine, so we see what he sees. In another shot, we watch the white European choreographer Francesca, played by Montse Triola, watching herself as she rehearses dance moves that construct a primitivist idea of Polynesianness. The suggested infinity mirror locks Polynesian movement culture in a colonial feedback loop, or, to return to de Man's autobiography, a specular structure. In confining itself to a claustrophobic, self-referential worldview that it also demonstrates holds no privileged connection to reality, Serra's film erodes the cinematic, which for Claire Colebrook has to do with the consolidation as self-evidence or common sense of point of view as world. This self-confinement manifests through a certain anonymization of Polynesianness. Some of the non-actors who play local characters are uncredited. Other characters, especially though not exclusively Polynesians, are named after the individuals who portray them. This uneven naming practice frustrates Polynesians' relation to diegesis. They are made to keep one foot in and one foot out, neither of the aesthetic realm, nor quite of the anthropological or geographic realm. Past Fiction's self-confinement also manifests through the possession of Polynesianness. Possession meets prosopopeia when de Roller fantasizes about becoming Shana, or having her become him. He envisions as a body swap Shana's ability to animate the principles he has so far represented, from a benevolent rebranding of colonialism as shared history or long-standing kinship, to a genocidal project that can result only in the post-colony's extinction. Let's consider a scene in which de Roller, lounging on a chaise with his paisley shirt open, scribbles in a notebook. Seemingly out of nowhere, he starts to giggle.
Ils vont tous se faire avoir. C'est sûr. Ce qui est sympa, c'est quand ils te verront toi, ce sera moi. Tu rentreras dans une pièce et ce sera moi. Quand tu iras leur parler, ce sera moi.
Dans quel sens?
Tu seras mes yeux. Tu seras mon bras armé. Shana, le haut commissaire.
Je ferai tout à ta place.
Exactement.
Ah oui.
Il faut que personne puisse le deviner. Il faut que tu restes dans l'ombre.
Ah ouais.
Moi, je vais partir et ils vont tous se réjouir en imaginant que j'ai une vie pourrie. Je vais tout laisser derrière moi. J'aurais tout laissé sauf toi.
Merci.
Tu m'apportes beaucoup, Shana. Plus que tu ne le penses.
C'est gentil.
Au moment où ils s'y attendront le moins, tu frapperas. Tu frapperas fort. C'est toi le prédateur. Eux, c'est le gibier. Ce sont les proies. Tu veux tous les bouffer. T'es une vraie carnassière. T'es une tigresse. T'es une lionne.
Une liane.
Ça te plaît?
Ouais.
So when he grants Shana the title of High Commissioner, de Roller uses the masculine form, le haut commissaire. He doesn't appoint her to the position, whether in reality or as a chimera, but turns her into him. De Roller is mirthful. We cannot detach this mirth from the sadism and the cannibalism of striking and eating praise, any more than from the vertigo of pondering gender variance, both Shana's and de Roller's own. Transition and detransition are here entirely rhetorical. Through Prosopopeia, de Roller imagines Shana dangerously male. And insofar as de Roller daydreams of living vicariously through Shana, he imagines himself dangerously female. Shana is a figure of enjoyment more than a subject of pleasure. The enjoyment does not belong to Shana. Moreover, she figures enjoyment to the extent that she stands in for non-belonging. Her smiling and laughing constitute far more than auditions for social inclusion, friendly interfaces linking to decidedly unfriendly ideas of ecological and social collapse. That a transfeminized figure channels these ideas is worth attending to, for transfemininity is often made to personify absence or death within a late liberal regime that arranges differences into, as Povinelli puts it, social identities that provide the conduits through which rights are circulated until they are twisted by these circulating rights and take on new identities. I borrow the adjective transfeminized from Jules Gill-Peterson, for whom it refers to what happens to groups subjects to transmisogyny, regardless of their being known or wishing to be known as transgender women. Mahaga Fanao, the actor, is a trans woman. Her character, Shana, has been identified as third gender Rere or Mahu in reviews. But the film doesn't offer diegetic cues as to how the character identifies. Shana is transfeminized precisely through the transphobic/transphilic social demand that, as an informant and an escort, figures of complementarity, she both stand in for and negate the phallus, the signifier of the other's signifier for Lacan. Undergirding Gill-Peterson's terminological intervention is the project of moving away from psychological readings of transmisogyny. And if I may risk a heretical claim, Gill-Peterson's material history of colonial and imperial transmisogyny as the infrastructure of the shared world is quite compatible with deconstruction's excavation of white mythology's foundationlessness, and even with the psychoanalytic account of the dissimulation of ontological incompletion by contingent forms of symbolic identity. And I'm quoting Edelman here. All three approaches, so this material history, the deconstructive approach, and the psychoanalytic approach, pragmatically enable us to grasp late liberalism as the apotheosis of a semantically but not economically arbitrary prosopopeal process through which antagonism and exclusion, null sets, are given shape within a given order. Shana, as a personification of both the perpetuation of and the fallout from nuclear proliferation, represents what Frédéric Nérat calls the double body of the Anthropocene. One body of the Anthropocene is in a position of majority and is overtly technophilic, having established itself by way of an a-naturalist position. The other body is composed of what we call minoritarian bodies of the Anthropocene, a body sacrificed on the altar of progress and its residue, a body that for several centuries now has contested the a-naturalist position, a recalcitrant body. Trans studies has noted that the face magnetizes aesthetic judgments about transfeminine authenticity, although a kind of authenticity whose standards of realness and clockiness often have little use for cisgender reference. Per Grace Lavery's Pragmatics of Transition, a clocky appearance is not one which exposes a trans woman as secretly a man. It's just as likely to expose a trans woman as secretly a woman. In past fiction, the face is remarkably a marker of inauthenticity. Male faces are deformed or rendered grotesque by efforts to contain ideologies and processes like extinction, which are non-subjective. And Shana's face isn't hers, maintains the High Commissioner, but his. Emma Haney in The New Woman describes the workings in modernist literature of the allegory of transfemininity, or the notions that trans women must mean something, and that the transfeminine is an object through which to explore alienation from self and community. Haney calls for an alleviation of the figurative pressure, or of this figurative pressure, such that the material conditions of trans women be rendered immediate and a political struggle be activated. I support this objective, but I doubt that the aesthetic is the best place to look for alternatives to figuration. Past fiction, in presenting artifice as artifice, and indeed laying bare to the ways transfeminized beings are made to embody what they are not, initiates a certain figural deflation. But beneath the projection, there's nothing. Serra produces no transgender or Ray or Mahu sociology from which to launch an anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggle. His artistic proposition is, for better or worse, imminent to the cinematic. So I've tried less to illustrate late liberalism's reliance on prosopopeia than to set a limit on that order's legibility as the real and given world. Past fiction, I've suggested, tropes and thus renders properly uncanny, as in duplicated, ghostly, efforts to cognize the contradictions of a world so close to annihilation that its present challenges can be apprehended only from the impossible vantage point of future extinction. Claire Colebrook aligns Deman with a counter-political politics. Any passage or transition to the political as the legitimate context for making sense of inscriptive systems must occlude the forces that generate the critical, politically astute subject reader. She goes on, if there's nothing to legitimate the transition from inscription to sense, then politics is not so much about expansion, explain the text by way of its being an epiphenomenon of a grander or global whole, but about collapse. It may seem irresponsible to advocate collapse amid collapse, yet not all collapses are alike, and this talk has found value in a deconstruction of the common sense on the basis of which late liberalism's settler and extractive violence can be articulated as world-making and world-building. Thank you.
Ronald, lovely to see you. Just hang on, let me get into a microphone. Thanks, Scott.
Hi. I really love your talk, and I have a question and a comment, very short. That I love your very quick reference to Jameson and Jameson's work on allegory. That seems to, maybe in a longer version of the paper, there's more there. But there's one moment that I thought, he has this whole criticism of the man, and in particular, the status of personification, but there's also in that text an undercurrent of concern with the Anthropocene, and towards one moment he even says that the glory of the Anthropocene is to have shown to us that we can change the world, and this is part of his general argumentation about the status of allegory. And I thought maybe if you could say something a little bit more, that was my commentary. My question is about the status of the self and it's sort of a question in between the Derridian and the Demanian stakes of your project. I wonder if the corrective to the specular structure of prosopopeia is something like the shattering of the mirror, or something other than that kind of position. I'm thinking also in particular about the way Derrida and Deman may not agree there about what to do with the autos. And I think that may have some bearing on the problems you're trying to get at, but it might also be external or extrinsic to them. So those are just two thoughts.
Yeah, they're excellent questions, so thank you. I'll try to respond briefly. So my contention is not mainly with Jameson, but with interpretations of Jameson and eco-criticism, and so there is indeed a kind of missing section here, which exists in the longer version, which is on the way that Hermé Zeman and Elizabeth de Loffry have interpreted Jameson, And they are very interested in a kind of project of allegorical repair that rehabilitates the idea of totality. And so Zeman, for example, is not shy to mention that there are bad totalities and there are good totalities, and the good totalities are contingent and they're changeable, and therefore they're open to transformation, which is to say that they're not total, right? And I think that, you know, it's not that I'm sort of pitting prosopopoeia against allegory so much as I'm thinking about two kinds of critical discourses or genealogy. And in prosopopoeia, there has been, thanks to Demand's sort of influence on the trope, there has been an openness to thinking about the sort of obscenity of a mode of totalization, and then to see what happens when you take it seriously. In terms of the shattering of the self, so part of what I'm trying to do in this paper and in this work is to see is to take seriously Cole Brooks' definition of the cinematic in her new work, Who Would You Kill to Save the World? The cinematic for her is the consolidation of point of view as world, right? So there's a collapse, there's no distinction between the world and how we perceive it, and the production of that kind of subject, which we would understand as a subject of hegemony, is what she understands to be the work of the cinematic. And she looks at the way that the cinematic is sort of hinted at in blockbuster films, like disaster films. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading that book is that surely there's also a way that films frustrate the cinematic, because no individual film can actually live up to the promise of the total system or the perfect point of view that equals the world. And so looking at this kind of auteur cinema makes it an easier task than looking at blockbuster films, right? Insofar as the cracks are showing much more clearly. And so this is like a film about like the construction of a white mythology, but also the foundationlessness or the impossibility of that mythology. But thank you for your questions.
We have time for one more question. Yes, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I guess I wanted to come back to, the question of the nuclear sublime and what we were doing with that. And it's been a while since I read the Ferguson, but I guess I was struck throughout here. It seems to me that in all of a lot of the writings that I'm familiar with on the atomic age and the nuclear problem, like Günter Anders and Jonathan Schell, and there's always a kind of problem of modality that emerges here about, like, it sounds almost like a kind of Heideggerian being towards death writ large, where we get now like the possibility of our own impossibility, right? But you also get these weird things like, you know, Schell uses the idea that the fact that even if we were to get rid of all the scientists who understand how to build bombs, that possibility, once it's been inscribed, is now rediscoverable. And so actually he defends the kind of strange synecdoche by which it would be humanity killing itself if there were a nuclear war. It would be all of humanity killing itself, because the possibility of that knowledge is now ascribable to humanity as a subject and not just to individual scientists or something. And, you know, Anders has the whole thing about, like, one of the things that changes with the introduction of nuclear weapons is that now the end of the world has entered into history in a way that it never had before, by becoming possible in a way that it never was before. So I guess there's just something really strange, it seems to me, in a lot of these discourses happening about the relation between possibility and impossibility and actuality. And I was wondering, I haven't seen the film, I'm gonna go watch it like as soon as I leave here. But I was wondering if there's anything there that you've thought about, kind of how these different modes of figuration and of cinematic representation play with these stakes of modality that are at play in the question of extinction. And yeah, anyway, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think part of the kind of meta narrative that I could impose onto this project is that I'm trying to figure out how it's possible that the desire to destroy is stated, and for liberalism to not be able to take it seriously, right? Like, so we can see it right now. It's happening, and so like, what does it look like for example, the admiral to make these threats? even if he'll say, like, no one knows what we're doing, right? Like, he still has made the threats throughout the film to everyone, but it seems like there's this kind of impossibility of cognizing these threats. In terms of thinking about that with possibility and impossibility, I mean, I know we're short on time, so I would say a lot of the scholarship on the nuclear event is quite Bedouin in its approach to the event, right? And this piece by Ferguson, which is on the nuclear sublime, is understood by Jessica Hurley as being symptomatic of a kind of over-fetishization of the bomb in discourses of the nuclear and an inattention to infrastructure or ordinariness. But the piece is all about ordinariness and the way that the sublime sort of distributes itself in actuarial calculation, because the piece begins with the impossibility, the exclusion of nuclear disaster from insurance packages, right? Like, right. So there's something that's impossible that is also becoming like the kind of basis of how we understand what's insurable, and I try to play a little bit with that language in the essay. But it is, I mean, the Ferguson essay, which I highly recommend revisiting, is also fascinating because it's like properly deconstructive, and we don't think of Francis Ferguson as a deconstructive thinker, but the essay is very much aligned with Derrida's own in the same issue.
Thank you. I've got to got my eye on the time. I do have some questions about the sublime. Maybe we'll get back to them at the end. Thank you so much, Jean Thomas. Okay, our second speaker this afternoon is Dixa Ramirez-Dolio, who is an associate professor in the English department here at Brown University. Her research focuses on the literatures and the histories of the extended Caribbean, especially the Dominican Republic and Haiti. She's also engaged with Black critical theory and literary criticism, and her scholarship has been published widely, including places like Atlantic Studies, Avidly, The Black Scholar, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Small Axe, where she serves on the editorial committee, and Social Text. Dr. Ramirez-Dolio's first book was Colonial Phantoms, Belonging and Refusal in the Dominican Americas from the 19th century to the present. That was published in 2019 with NYU Press. The book argues that dominant Western discourses have ghosted the Dominican Republic despite its central place in the architecture of the Americas. Colonial Phantoms received the Barbara Christian Literary Award from the Caribbean Studies Association and also the 2019 Isis Duarte Book Prize from the Haiti Dominican Republic section of the Latin American Studies Association. Her second book, called This Will Not Be Generative, was published in 2023 by Cambridge University Press in the series Elements in Feminism and Contemporary Critical Theory. Dr. Ramirez-Dolio's talk today is entitled Caves, Octaves, More Reality. Dixa.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Elizabeth Wilson and everyone who made this possible. I was excited to receive the invitation. My second book, the long essay entitled This Will Not Be Generative, uses close reading analysis of various works by Donna Haraway, as well as Monique Alleward's Ariel's Ecology, Plantations, Personhood, and Colonialism in the American Tropics, and Lisa Wells's New York Times nonfiction bestseller, Believers Making Life at the End of the World, to argue that these writings presume that even at the end of the world, white survival and control will endure, even when in rhetorical symbiosis with local ecologies and through fantasies of the tutelage of non-African indigenous groups. In these discourses, Blackness, which is never also indigenous, continues performing the function it has had in Western epistemes as that which must be destroyed so that it can give life to other life forms. That is what I call blackness as compost. A tendency in these writings is their being grounded in a secularized Protestant episteme, which emerges in the underlying assumption that generativity is an ethical, moral, biological, and semiotic good. I read these texts closely and with methods inspired by Caribbean literary studies, Black critical theory, including the work of Excel Carrera, and the theoretical innovations of various procedures of negative criticism and deconstruction. I contrast the disguising and obfuscating procedures of the speculative mode that these eco-critics embrace with the semiotics of horror in Jordan Peele's 2017 film Get Out and Ari Aster's 2019 film Midsommar. I obviously can't do all of that, and I make other kinds of arguments, but I will focus on maybe 1.5 strands before moving into part 2, which shifts entirely. Patricia Jaeger's concept of the unthought known is useful to consider here. After Christopher Bolles, Jaeger defines this concept as, quote, the omnipresence of ideas that are known but not acknowledged, end quote. Writing about U.S. Southern women's literature, Jaeger also calls this an, quote, everyday world of white unseeing, in which many literary works feature, and I continue to quote here, white citizens' genuine shock at encountering a world that they see every day, suggesting a deliberate sequestration of knowledge, end quote. In her analysis, motifs of soil and burials make evident, or more appropriately submerge, the sublimation taking place. Quote, in Southern literature, extraordinary numbers of Black women, men, and children fall into the landscape and disappear. It is as if the foundation or basis for this world is made out of repudiated throwaway bodies that mire the earth, a landscape built over and upon the melancholic detritus, the disposable bodies denied by white culture, end quote. These bodies are, quote, cast away without funerals, left unmourned, end quote. In my book, I read closely for the unthought known that sustains the grammar of these ecological writings. I show how a semiotics that seems to be liberatory and generative for an inclusive we remains reliant on a grammar of suffering and destruction of those in the blackened position. The violation of Black people's bodies becomes the central metaphor in Monique Allaward's Ariel's Ecology. Unlike other works of eco-criticism, Allaward's literary analysis of various colonial texts from and about the Caribbean and North America engages directly with the history of enslavement. However, this engagement ends up reinstating Blackness as compost through her concept of parahumanity. Defining her term of parahumanity, Allaward enumerates that it is defined as being, that the parahuman body was, quote, opened up by colonials attempting to manage Black persons, particularly their capacity for collective resistance, end quote. What rendered parahumans and I'm quoting here, distinguishable from other bodies produced in emerging biopolitical regimes is that her body was broken in parts, an ear amputated for petit marronage, a hand for theft, an arm pulled from the body by the sugar mill, and sometimes a head cut from the body for resistance so total as to warrant death, end quote. For Allaward, parahumanity usefully gave rise to a minoritarian mythos of the Americas in which the autonomy of parts engenders new musings, end quote. Here, the maiming of Black bodies into distinct parts, which she argues made white enslavers anxious, is refigured and reshaped into an inspiring parahumanity that can provide lessons for us as we face the end of the world. The absolute horror of certain physical and spiritual torture under enslavement becomes equated to the anxiety of the one responsible for ensuring that the maiming was not only possible, but also lawful, property-yielding, and energetically and spiritually enriching for the enslaving class. In rendering this total antagonism between these structural positions to invoke Frank Wilderson's work into a teachable moment for us, the eco-critic extends the violent metaphysics of the world whose end she continuously foresees. Indeed, these eco-critical writings, while anxiously proclaiming the end of the world in their titles and anxiously cooking up ways to weave further biological and energetic entanglements that for some reason will forestall this end up extending its genocidal sadistic violence. As Ruha Benjamin argues in her response to Haraway's slogan, "Make kin, not babies," quote, "vampirically, white vitality feeds on black demise," end quote. In most of the eco-criticism I have read, or in the numerous art shows inspired by the Anthropocene that I have seen, there is a tendency to either entirely erase blackness and black suffering or to include it among a set of unexpected equivalences. As to elaborate on the concept of the plantationocene, Haraway responds, "The plantation really depends on very intense forms of labor slavery, including also machine labor slavery, a building of machines for exploitation and extraction of earthlings. I think it is also important to include the forced labor of non-humans, plants, animals, and microbes in our thinking," end quote. And the "we" here refers to Haraway and Anat Singh, who seems to rush to include a corrective to Haraway's response. She says, right after, quote, "I'll just add briefly that the term plantation for me evokes the heritage of a particular set of histories involving what happened after the European invasion of the New World, particularly involving the capture of Africans as enslaved labor and the simplification of crops so as to allow enslaved laborers to be agricultural workers," end quote. Citing Isabel Stengers on her concept of symbiosis, Allawert, like Haraway, admits that, quote, "the relation among parts is not harmonious," which means that, quote, "when a symbiosis or compromise is formed, it always excludes and even violates some of the entities that compose it and that might resist it," end quote. Moreover, despite the terror that this openness evokes, it offers grounds for an ethics of relationality, by which I mean an engagement in which a body is recognized into a medium that extends into and is extended into by media that are proximate to it, and sometimes even media that are not proximate to it. This process of mediation can strengthen, weaken, or eliminate that body, but in all cases, it continually transforms and diversifies the body. It is, by my account, no accident that it is in radical abolitionist texts, such as William Earl Jr.'s Obie or the History of Three-Fingered Jack, that the conventionally sentimental scene of crying produces effects that eliminate the conception of skin as a boundary and surface to realize the body as a medium. As I note in chapter 4, the maroon's tears culminate in a violent expulsion of the insides of the body, here no longer abstracted as feelings but concretized as blood, end quote. Towards the end of the book, in her chapter on Afro-American fetishes and voodoo possession, she again admits a level of vicissitude, Allawert that is, about some of her theorization of maimed Black people's body parts as productive, but forges forward. In positing personhood as a process that depends on the fetish's collation of material forces, I propose that personhood is emergent, contingent, and not based on the division of human beings from non-human entities. Given that this mode of personhood developed in plantation spaces in which Black agents' humanity was brutally refused so that they could be converted into parahumans, it might seem not nearly strong enough to constitute an always potentially soluble and non-exclusively human personhood, instead sticking with the subject, which despite its problems, allows a politically expedient fiction of the human as a permanent, irreducible identity that bears fundamental rights, end quote. I found it crucial to include these long quotes because this text seems strangely attractive to scholars in various fields, including in conversations about otherwise worlds and Black ecologies, and of course for those aboard the eco-critical train. It makes me wonder why others cannot discern what to my reading sits in plain sight. In Ariel's ecologies, although the bodies most susceptible to the terror of openness, and I'm quoting here, she calls it the terror and she calls it openness, are Black people's bodies, Allawert asserts that, quote, what Orlando Patterson has called spaces of social death was a condition that touched not only Afro-Americans, but all persons moving through the colonies, end quote. It is true that to be human is to suffer. But it is strange to equate the total unfreedom of enslavement with the general human suffering of the one not enslaved. What is at stake for one who must make such an argument? Though eco-critics almost always state that European colonialism was bad, and Atlantic slavery, when mentioned, was also bad, they rarely, if ever, delve into how the white enslaver and colonizer was also transformed by the process into becoming a parasitic entity addicted to black fungibility. Writing about colonial Saint-Domingue or Haiti, Colin Dayan provides another way to interpret the disaggregating violence of slavery. Quote, long quote, very worth it. What I want briefly to consider is how the bodily tortures and incarnate terrors necessary to sustain the institution of slavery were projected onto the victims by their oppressors. Numerous are the accounts of slaves committing suicide, especially the Bosals, African-born and unseasoned, who had not yet been integrated into the slave community. Believing that they would return to Africa after death, they hanged themselves one by one, ate dirt, and swallowed their tongues. In order to prevent what was judged a criminal destruction of property and to derail what Moreau de Saint-Méry called a Pythagorean voyage, which is really interesting, planters contrived mutilations that would discourage such attempts to return home. Here is Moreau's description of how planters dissuaded the Ibos from suicide. And quote within quote, they cut off the head of the first one who killed himself, or only his nose and ears, that they keep on top of a pole. Then the others, convinced that no one would ever dare reappear in his native land, thus dishonored in the opinion of his compatriots, and fearing the same treatment, renounced their ghastly plan of emigration. End of Moreau's quote. This gruesome bodily deformation shows how profoundly whites both understood and perverted the mysteries of the spirit, end quote. Several of the texts about slavery that I teach attempt to represent the antagonism between the black position and the non-black position. Antagonism, again, Wilderson's term, equates the forced entanglements consonant to enslavement and beyond, equates with forced entanglements. For instance, Évelie Trouillot's 2003 novel, the infamous Rosalie l'Enfant, which focuses on Lisette, an enslaved black girl in 1760s Saint-Domingue, during the mass mushroom poisonings of white planters by insurrecting blacks, evinces several examples of unasked for entanglement and porosity. The novel opens with Lisette running toward the planter's house before her owners become so angry that she will be punished. While she runs, she experiences energetic and almost biological entanglement with an enslaved man who had recently been burned at the stake, and with those who had been forced to witness and participate in the horror. Quote, the screams of Paladin's children as their father was burned at the stake on the Beau plantation still resound beneath my skin. The master had commanded all Negroes to bring something to soak the fire with and watch the spectacle. A few lines down, the charred skin stuck to my pupils, darkening the depths of my soul, end quote. It is almost as if Lisette's very biology had changed to adapt to the new information in the form of Paladin's suffering and dying at the stake. In this sense, the black slaves' entanglement with each other at the physical, energetic, and spiritual levels is reshaped by the hyperbolic torture of the sadistic enslaver, who is not content merely with the execution for his own children, who do not, to the enslaver, count as his children, except in this scene of sadism, had been forced to add kindle to the fire. In Mary Prince's History, the 1833 testimonial narrative of an enslaved black woman born in Bermuda, she recounts being forced to work in the salt mines. The changes in the body attendant to this work are described. Quote, our feet and legs from standing in the salt water for so many hours soon became full of dreadful boils, which eat down in some cases to the very bone, afflicting the sufferers with great torment, end quote. How am I to transform scenes such as these, which display the much lauded eco-critical generative entwinement with other humans and with local ecologies, into potentiality for the world not to end? If all we have to forestall the world's end is an alchemical formula that transforms such events into potentiality, can it be any surprise that some have called for the end of the world? 2, what can I do? One must begin somewhere. Begin what? The only thing in the world worth beginning, the end of the world, of course. Aimé Césaire, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. At the end of the choreographed piece entitled Water Wheel in Melody, created by Dominican-born and Berlin-based choreographer and dancer Lihia Lewis, the dancers meander about the stage, confused. Jerky and sharp movements full of muscle tension inform the choreography and much of the preceding hour of the performance, evoking mechanical motor functions damaged from overexerted effort. The choreography from the first part could be described as a study of how racialized scripts require various forms of physical constraint, rendering all of them grotesque. After these forms and scripts break down, the lighting and soundscape change so that the stage comes to resemble a cave. Water drips in this watery cavern and light filters in, evincing an opening above somewhere. If only the confused dancers, wet and enveloped in darkness, would figure out how to emerge. First, they would have to perceive it as a potential opening or pathway out of the cavern, but they seem either unaware of or apathetic to the light streaming from above. They are stuck, listless, without purpose, now that the pressures of performing as a certain type of human have broken down. Waterwheel allegorizes a world in which to live is to inhabit a preordained role until dying of exhaustion. Unacknowledged and perhaps unperceived, the light lingers. I find it salient to return to Plato's, or rather Socrates' allegory of the cave. Prisoners sit bound so that their entire perception of reality is defined by the shadows moving on a wall of the cave, made possible by the activity behind the prisoners who cannot perceive it, which is unnamed characters moving puppets before a fire. One day, one of these prisoners is, quote, freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk, and look up toward the light. And he is, to continue to quote, pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before, end quote. It becomes clear that the freed prisoner is not thrilled with this shift in perspective, nor is he convinced that what he is witnessing is in fact more reality. Indeed, someone has to drag him away from inside the cave by force up the rough, steep path and doesn't let him go until he had dragged him into the sunlight, end quote. At some point, finally, the unbound one not only accepts this amplification of his previous understanding of reality, but also cannot fathom going back to live in his previous circumstance within the cave, even if, as Socrates colorfully puts it, quote, there had been honors, praises, or prizes among them for the one who was the sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, end quote. No prize down in the cave compares to living in the reality of the sunlight above it. He would rather, continues Socrates, suffer anything outside the cave than live like that, end quote. There are more details to this fascinating story that many of you are very familiar with, I'm sure, but the experience of more reality is not the same as arriving to a paradise. Instead, the experience Socrates describes is one of rupture, irritation, pain, and perhaps even terror. It is fraught with dangers. When the freed one returns to tell his bound comrades in the cave about the sunlight, they want to kill him. They do not believe him and think that he wants to harm them, and so they want to kill him. Only one dancer remains in Lewis's water wheel. The others seem to have perished in the ordeal, but at no point are they bound. The pressures of enduring the gendered performances to exhaustion had been enough of a binding. Life here is a danse macabre. What if the end of the world denotes going over the edge of the acceptable five-sense reality? What if the end of the world is the end of a dogmatic rationalist perspective and a reclaiming of a wisdom that is not merely out there, but encoded in all things, including our own bodies, by which I mean the physical, energetic, and spiritual layers that together comprise our individual bodies? What if we don't have to search for more reality in maimed and decomposing bodies of blackened people destroyed by forced entanglements? What if the end of the world that we both inherited and continue to create through our narrowed and stunted perceptions is akin to visiting the world of a stone, or above a cave, or above our octave? Mimrose Bobrun, a Haitian anthropologist and initiate of the Guinan branch of Haitian Vodou, describes plunging into the world of a stone. While sitting with her teacher, Antanzia, in the latter's home, she touches one of Tanzia's stones, and the ensuing experience is one among many that shatters some part of Bobrun's earthly egoic self and the specific perspective of reality she has been conditioned, as many of us have, to understand as reality itself. She writes, "When the stone hit my hand, I felt vertigo. Colored points appeared before my eyes. I couldn't see Antanzia anymore. I was seized with panic. She cries out for her teacher, whom she no longer sees or perceives, and her teacher reassures her and tries to direct her energy, which had been plunged into vertiginous chaos. Antanzia says, 'You have only changed worlds. Don't be afraid. Look for a point of color and fix your attention on it.' And then she presses Bobrun's temple to help fix her attention on an indigo blue point. Quote, 'Suddenly I saw Antanzia in the form of light on my left. I also saw another form of light which held out its right hand to me. I recognized it as the stone. It greeted me. I responded to its greeting with a smile of satisfaction. The stone asks her what she wants, and she responds that she, quote, wants to see the world in which the stone belongs. Come, the luminous body said to me, I'll take you with me. I went through a world that I wouldn't know how to describe. It was beauty and magnificence and made of many colors, unknown to me until then. Nevertheless, I was not completely at ease. Here, this is our world. Each one of us has power. Humans have misinterpreted our role alongside them. Each human being has his correspondent in our world, the luminous body told me. Is this true for me too? Of course. This explanation plunged me into profound reflection, and I lost my vision. But I was not returned to myself again, that is to say, to my normal state. I continued to pose questions. I heard answers coming from very far away, and then I lost contact with my interlocutor. I heard nothing more. I turned to see Antanzia, whether Antanzia was with me, but to my great surprise, I was in my parents' house. She had run, and without knowing that she was running. As this and other texts about spiritual transformation demonstrate, these forms of initiations, which are also world endings, never themselves end. There is always more world to end, and it is rarely pleasant. But like the freed prisoner in the allegory of the cave, even the worst circumstance in the sunlight is better than the best possible version of being in the cave. The kind of embodied knowing that Bobrun acquires through experiences like the one I just described gives the mystic or shaman a perception of more reality in this same realm we all inhabit. It may also give them the potential to travel to other realms in a life lived marvelously, and by marvelously I mean in this definition that the writer Alejo Carpentier offers. He describes the marvelous as, I don't know if I have the quote, yes, that which arises from a privileged revelation of reality, an unaccustomed or singularly favorable illumination of the previously unremarked riches of reality, an amplification of the measures and categories of reality, perceived with peculiar intensity due to an exaltation of the spirit, which elevates it to a kind of limit state, end quote. In other words, the marvelous is more reality or a heightened perception of it. South African Zulu Sangoma, or shaman Credo Mutua, asserts, quote, "We in Africa know, and please don't ask me to explain further, that the human being possesses 12 senses, not 5 senses, as the Western people believe. One day this will be accepted scientifically, 12. So we must not call those yet unknown senses supernatural. They are within the very borders of the shining land of nature," end quote. The shaman and mystic, however, also know that to unlock these capabilities within the human body is not the same thing as being closer to God. Among those who argue that all those extra senses can become a distraction from the real work was the early 20th century Armenian mystic G. Gurdjieff. His concept of the higher octave might be useful, though it is way too complicated to explain fully today, not that I fully understand it. As described by 2 of his followers, including the Russian mathematician P.D. Uspensky, the universe is structured like an almost endless number of octaves that get closer and closer to God. The octaves are structured like the musical scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si is one octave, and then do is starts the next one. And here actually is a sketch of the octave, or the ray of creation, by one of Gurdjieff's most well-known students, though not a direct student. She was really inspired by his teaching, and that's the Spanish-born painter Remedios Varo, surrealist painter. I wanted to include it here because of all these little circles and lines have significance. So each do constitutes another octave of experience from the previous octave, which ended in C. Our own realm constitutes an octave, and the do above ours is invisible to us, except in circumstances of perceiving amplified reality or a reality distinct from the normative earthly one. Activating that jump to that higher do is the work of the mystic, and I would argue it's precisely that world-ending experience of sunlight outside of the cave, world-ending but also expanding. Within each octave are innumerable lateral octaves, like branches growing out of the central octave of a tree or tree trunk. And in between specific notes of the octave, as you can see between fa and mi, are jumps that can only be achieved through external shocks, as what Gurdjieff called them, such as, for instance, newly acquired knowledge that reorganizes your organism. Traveling to the world of a stone would constitute such a shock, but so would reading a book that shocks you into understanding something in your very body, expanding your perception of reality beyond mere intellectual understanding, however important the latter may also be. And Varo, Remedios Varo, marked these shock points with those thick lines that you see there. A common shamanic initiation is called dismemberment. Torn apart limb to limb by creatures and beings in the dream world or as an out-of-body experience, the shaman nevertheless knows it as materially experienced reality, with all the shock of having known what dying feels like. What are the differences between shamanic dismemberment and mystical ego destruction on one hand, and the kind of physical and spiritual dismemberment of the blackened body that an eco-critic rearranges into a productive theory of generativity on the other? The difference does not lie in choice, for shamanic and mystical journeys are often described as pressing from beyond, and given the travails can strike some as a curse. But I have identified three differences, though there are likely more. The first is that there are no shortcuts for anyone on the spiritual shamanic path in all of these narratives that I'm reading. There are no shortcuts. There is an understanding among various mystical traditions, which to my knowledge all agree that the soul is eternal, that whatever is not experienced in this lifetime was either experienced in a previous one or awaits the mystic, who is potentially every single human being, in another lifetime. The painful spiritual progress is there for those who undergo the experiences themselves. The eco-critic who may outsource the suffering that may accrue potentiality cannot outsource the sufferings attendant to spiritual growth. The second difference I've identified is that shamanic and mystical shattering rarely come in the form of permanent physical disfigurement. Physical difficulties tend to be more like sweat lodges and other tests of endurance, and admittedly, survival is not always promised, though physical death is not the end goal of these initiatory moments. It is crucial to understand that in almost every shamanic and mystical tradition I have read about, much of initiation happens in the dream space, which is nothing like what the Western world has come to understand as such. The dream space includes out-of-body experiences where a part of one's soul experiences realities entirely as if they occurred in the physical. And there, the shaman and like Bobrun and Credomuto and others whose narratives I'm reading, they describe meeting guides and overcoming certain challenges. And indeed, overcoming terror is a central component of many of these initiatory experiences. More reality frequently contains overpowering forces and energies. Theologian and philosopher Rudolf Otto calls such encounters the mysterious tremendum, which he describes with words such as, quote, a sudden eruption from the depths of the soul with spasms and convulsions, a grisly horror and shuddering that may be developed into something beautiful and pure and glorious. The hushed, trembling, and speechless humility of the creature in the presence of whom or what? In the presence of that which a mystery inexpressible and above all creatures, end quote. That was all Otto. Moreover, Otto identifies the source of this encounter with the soul itself, which is connected to the eternal and not something as mundane as another human or the state committing violence. And the third difference I've identified is that eco-criticism and this is a big one, tends towards materialism, at times combined with figurative gestures towards what are often described as indigenous ways of knowing and being. But, at least in the work of writers such as Haraway and Wells, these gestures remain at the surface and are limited in that they do not and perhaps cannot perceive how much these indigenous ways of knowing are inseparable from deeply mystical perceptions of reality. The one focused on matter as reality often cannot discern the inseparability between the mundanely perceivable objects and actions and the innumerable but very specific subtle realms where various forms of energies reside. Those with that more reality perception aim to become vessels conducing energies. And the aim generally is not to grow more complex entanglements with more earthly matter. Those who lean more towards this goal, again, in several of the traditions I'm reading about, they are usually considered to be working more with the left hand, which also tend to use this knowledge to accrue the prizes and praises of the earthly material realm, such as more power and money. Overall, much of the eco-criticism I have read seems to be grounded in an underlying drive towards more earthly matter. There is not enough, and I'm closing here, there is not enough evidence that will ever prove to the rationalist that humans have access to more reality. And the reason for this is that the rationalist who has come to stand for the modern intellectual human is led more by dogma and a closed-off cynicism than by empirical evidence. And philosopher and theologian David Bentley Hart puts it this way: it would be difficult to exaggerate how fanatical this devotion to an essentially mechanistic materialism can prove at times. Otherwise seemingly sane and intelligent persons regularly advance arguments that, but for their deep and fervent faith in a materialist picture of nature, they would undoubtedly recognize as absurd and circular. End quote. And comparative religions scholar Jeffrey Kripal expresses a similar frustration. He writes, quote, "At the end of the day, though, most of these objections boil down to a simple and simplistic attempt to control what is on the table so that the only permissible evidence left there is evidence that supports the materialist assumptions. It is very easy to explain all of reality if you get to define what that all is. It is very easy to explain everything on the table if you have just taken everything off the table that you cannot explain," end quote. In another text, Kripal argues that it is not that things have been swept off the table and disappear, rather they are suppressed. And though this hubristic and violent enterprise of suppression has been successful to some extent, it hasn't fully worked. The deep, writes Kripal, shows itself to the surface, but it also largely determines the behavior of the surface. In other words, rationalist approaches to reality have bound all these world-ending and initiatory events, as well as entire traditions of embodied knowledge that map paths towards more reality and to higher octaves. Remember, more reality is not necessarily good or a paradise. They have bound all these things to big, heavy rocks and thrown them into the sea, hoping for them to drown, never to be seen or heard from again. But this does not mean that they cease to exist. What may occur, however, is that the one who does not wish to see narrows his perception and vision to a sliver, insisting that what is perceived through these deadened senses constitutes all of reality. There, he offers, quote, honors, praises, or prizes among them for the one who has the sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dixa. We have 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll take a short break. Do you need some water? Yeah.
Alex, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for that. That was wonderful. I'm trying to formulate the question, which is basically going to be, where does organized religion and monotheism fit into this? Because clearly, those are not the types of traditions that you're talking about, right? But those are also pathways to this expanded sensorium, or at least they claim to be, right? So, yeah, I'm wondering how you're thinking about that. And then I'm also thinking about, of course, religion, particularly Christianity's ties to the kind of histories of enslavement and colonialism, right? That are at the heart of the more eco-critical part, the first part of the paper. So I'm not sure that quite makes sense, but yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts.
No, thanks, Alex. It makes a lot of sense. And I've thought about this a lot. And what's interesting is because I'm interested in this idea of more reality, or like beyond five sense reality, and not necessarily because there's a whole conversation about this, especially in the sciences, in relation to plant medicines, or LSD, for example. But in a lot of these narratives I'm reading of the mystic, et cetera, even though some shamanistic traditions obviously are very, they see plant medicines as a divine energy, but most of them it's not through anything. It just happens, or you entrain for it to happen. And these all tend, to my knowledge, and I'm open to knowing that there are exceptions to what I know, because I obviously am not reading about all of them, but the ones I'm approaching, so like certain kinds of Tibetan Buddhism to Haitian Vodou, like certain parts of Haitian Vodou, certain parts of Christianity, are like the more mystical extremes, or like esoteric, right? They have different names. And it's interesting because depending on which religion they correspond to, they have either been extremely suppressed by the main sort of branches of the organized part of the religion, or they're included in different ways. But they tend towards like I'm interested in texts that are understood as being mystical Christian texts, which are really fascinating and say very similar things to like what is said in Tibetan Buddhism and what is said in this branch of Haitian Vodou, which is, I mean, it's so interesting reading about it. I didn't know about this branch of Vodou, the mystical branch, and many of the teachings are just almost exactly like Tibetan Buddhism. And so it's almost like at that level, or rather, not level, but at that that approach to it that is so much about like the perception is the reality. And so if your perception widens, you have access to more reality and other realms even. It seems consonant across these. And there are really important differences, so I'm not trying to oversimplify between that, but there is a sense that some of what, when I quoted someone and I said the violent hubristic enterprise of colonialism has included organized religion, right? And it's interesting that it has kind of evolved into a rationalism that can be atheist, not necessarily. I think the underpinning is really secular Protestantism as the liberal kind of order basis. But it's that now, but it was, the basis is organized religious Christianity in general. Yeah. I know much less about like Islam, for example, but interestingly, Gurdjieff, who is a deeply idiosyncratic mystic, and that's why I'm fascinated by what he's writing. But a lot of other people who have written about him say that he got his ideas and learned from Sufi monasteries. And Sufi is interesting because it's considered a branch of Islam, and others have said it, and it includes a lot of mystical Christianity and Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah, I hope that answers.
Thank you, Dixa. Scott, Tangam has got a question there.
Thank you, Dixa. That was a really brilliant paper, very, very illuminating and very serious in its stakes. So while I feel, complete solidarity with what you've proposed, I want to ask a question which may seem to be sort of methodological and which may be political, or maybe about how to go forward from here. I mean, for shamans, of course, and for most spiritual traditions, this kind of mystical experience of more reality is potentially available to all humans, right? And you yourself said that at some point. And I'm thinking about the fact, and I feel embarrassed sort of confessing this here, I'm thinking about the fact that some of us think about literature and the study of literature as being another pathway to certain sort of experiences of more reality. I mean, in the sense that poetry and you know, various forms of art can be considered to be pathways, alternative pathways to mysticism, and perhaps in some kind of close adjacency to the mystical process. So because of this, even while I don't want to flatten things out at all, because of this, I'm wondering whether, you know, instead of simply, what it would mean instead of simply saying that the eco-critic, or that many materialist eco-critics today are sort of doing something that is so divergent from where the mystical, where a more mystical set of traditions could lead us. What would it mean to say that actually there are points of intuition there too, but that they somehow get cut off, or they somehow are diverted, but that the role of those who understand that there are, you know, that there's a whole history of traditions allowing us to reconnect matter with subtler realms and spiritual, you know, conceptions of world and all of that, that our role would be to guide those eco-critics beyond that point where they cut things off, rather than sort of set things up as a sort of you know, an opposition. Yeah, so just wondering whether there's a way of seeing even those moments in the Monique Allward as moments of potential, moments of intuition, which then sort of seem to be co-opted or kind of reduced into something else, but which could have gone elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't think it's opposition. I think that I place them in opposition because, let me go back. And I don't have a full response to your question, but I'm thinking through it, and the reason it's not oppositional is because the eco-critic is not, to me, a static, essential entity in stone. And so it is possible for the so-called eco-critic to shift and move in a certain direction. And so, you know, this is why in the book, at least, I'm really just very emphatically like, this is what this text argues, this text, right? Because this is not some kind of essentialist position where the scholar, I imagine the scholar is never shifting in their ideas. These are living ideas that evolve in time. Moreover, the way I'm thinking of this is all part of a second, or rather a project I'm working through right now. It really is coming from a sense of taking seriously the question of, like, we're all on this earthly realm together, including with eco-critics, including with people who vote in a way we're not thrilled with. Like, we're here. And it is taking, and then when I read these mystical accounts, I was just inspired to think through this question of end of the world, and it's like, it became a joke for me, like, haha, another art show at the end of the world. And so it's just like really thinking with these mystics and thinking that we are together, we are, whether we like it or not. How can I sort of think through these things together? And I don't have a full answer yet, but it is in line, this is like where I'm coming from approaching the whole discourse. And moreover, maybe to be honest about this. I'm talking about this will not be generative on the occasion of this event, and it is not. It's like I did it, and that is closed, and it's not something that I am continuing to engage directly. Even though preparing for this, the second part, I actually was really inspired by, like, these shamans are talking about being dismembered, like, every night. Going through this initiatory process that is so common, it is partly called shaman sickness. It's just really, really common, and they're not asking for it. It just happens. And I'm like, how is this different than that, you know? And that helped me actually illuminate something. But it's genuinely something I am no longer, I don't consider myself part of that conversation really anymore. Except like my book is there in the world, but in terms of me now, does that, yeah.
Okay, we're at 4:15. So our third speaker this afternoon is Axel Carrera. Dr. Carrera is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Emory University. Her research is situated at the intersection of 20th century continental philosophy, the critical philosophy of race, particularly black critical theory, and the environmental humanities. She's published an essay called Para-Ontology, Interruption, Inheritance, or a Debt That One Often Regrets. And that's been published in the journal Critical Philosophy of Race. She's published a second essay titled Black Feminist Philosophy and the Politics of Refusal. And that's in the Oxford Handbook for Feminist Philosophy, published by OUP in 2020. And thirdly, an article on Franz Fanon on his notion of the racial epidermal schema, and that is in a Northwestern University Press book from 2019 called 50 Concepts for a Critical Phenomenology. Dr. Carrera is currently completing her first monograph titled The Climate of Race, Blackness and the Pitfalls of Anthropocene Ethics. In this book, Dr. Carrera examines the question of relationality in posthumanism, the question of relationality in new materialist ontologies, the question of relationality in speculative realism's professed return to metaphysics. The book reads the ethical core of critical thought in an age of the Anthropocene without losing sight of its perplexing and perhaps even necessary disavowals of matters relating to racial ecocide. Dr. Carrera's paper today is titled Void, of Course. Dr. Carrera.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. Ooh, no, now it's. Thank you to Diane especially for all her logistical and organizing efforts to get us all here. No, yeah, okay. Yeah, I knew that this is going to be, okay, how about now? Yeah? Okay. It is indeed, let me just say, first of all, I'm probably not going to get to talk about the why of the title, but I'm really, I welcome you to ask me about the title during Q&A. It is indeed the case that Anthropos imprints on what we might call, still provisionally, nature is undeniable. And the degree to which men's power over the earth has generated massive regimes of techno-ideologies of survival, that is, the degree to which life now appears to be nothing but techne, is equally irrefutable. Though most of us can affirm that contesting geology's ominous assessments is now alarmingly reactionary, it is also the case that merely appraising the politics of scientific or philosophical nomenclature has become disturbingly insufficient. For the most part, nonetheless, debates surrounding the term Anthropocene are informed by two broadly opposed discursive positions. On the one hand, accusation against the term Anthropocene reveal frustration with the perceived misnomer that, according to critical dissent, merely revived brute empiricism and naive pragmatisms at the expense of a vast range of philosophical work which had already displaced the Cartesianism at the root of modernity's violence. These accusations are certainly not far-fetched, and critiques alleged paranoia cannot overstate the punctual resurgence of a scientific rationality well trimmed for our contemporary ecological anxieties. On the other hand, and somewhat at odds with such criticism, one reads new materialism, conceptual reliance on various, One reads a new materialism, conceptual reliance on various development in the natural sciences. For new materialist feminists in particular, science is the crucial instrument for reorienting the ontological question. The problem with philosophy, as Jane Bennett pointed out, for instance, is its ongoing projection of human agency onto things. As a result, philosophical thinking is fated to remain largely incapable of producing real moral outrage. What is striking on the new materialist side of this debate is the chosen antidote to overcome the dangers of philosophy's alleged moral bankruptcy. Here, indeed, a vigorous salvific ontology is endorsed, and it prescribes a rather simple ethos, namely, everything is inherently interconnected, relationality is ontologically real, species entanglements are thoroughly corporeal, and what we really need is to rescue our ethical sensibilities from the longue durée of a seemingly recalcitrant Cartesian temporality. But, as it is perhaps the case with most prescriptive discourses burdened by any totalizing vocation, this new hyper-ethics of relationality also contains disavowed ambiguities, unacknowledged contradictions, and structural complicities with the very discursive position they denounce. For instance, they muffle the political framings of this ecological crisis, even as the construction and maintenance of both new and old racial enmities are rigorously intensifying. In other words, their dictum is that insofar as we are earth-bound, racial antagonism must be relinquished to the past by reclaiming our stories of species companionship and becoming with, to use Bruno Latour's language. The ethical scientific grand narrative framing this position isn't only silently operative. Its main prescriptive presumption, i.e., the earth is indeed reconstructible, and together we must save it. This presumption continues to justify massive institutions of technocratic repair, which have now extended the omnipotent power of their restoring duty beyond the earth by gradually gaining extraplanetary grounds. I'm still concerned with this tacit contract between contemporary ecological reason and the extractive politics of geoengineering, which are arguably now more than ever fortified by what Mary Jane Rubenstein recently deemed the dangerous religion of the corporate space race. It is indeed under such intensified Anthropocenic rearrangements that the question of relationality imposes itself on us repeatedly, as if itself skeptical about eco-criticism's vitalist agenda. Who are the we of this contract? Who are the lists of its signatories? Are all signatures equal? Can racialized people, for instance, afford to abide to this configuration of a we the people, we the posthuman, we the hyperobject, we earthly being, we Martians to come, indeed we who will survive as long as we can resist together the deathly advent of our collective extinction? Is it possible, even for those like Félix Guattari, for instance, who resist reducing relationality to the holistic simplicity of a unified one, is it possible to think difference unbounded by the duplicitous appeals of equivalence or identity? Can the realities of racial difference create, as if necessarily, both concrete and ontological difficulties for relationalities imposing moralism? Whither is anti-Blackness bound under such rehabilitated vitalist regime? Or is Fred Moten right to understand that when and where Blackness is concerned, relationality is, quote, an expression of power structured by the givenness of a transcendental subjectivity that the Black cannot have, but which the Black can be had, unquote. Are eco-criticism's various discourse of entanglements, therefore, disguised iterations of a global anti-Black order of exploitation and premature Black death? In sum, can relationality legitimately claim its redemptive promises over and against the self-serving appeals of racial ecocide? Early in my attempt at articulating the difficulties emerging from the Anthropocene's conceptual landscape, I argued that the limitation of the discourse resulted from a generalized reluctance to face global imperial injustices. The latter, I contended, was coupled with visions of the future drowned in apocalyptic narratives that not only renewed forms of outdated vitalism, I also argued that just as it decreed the death of the transcendental subject, contemporary eco-criticism, notably new materialism, posthumanism, and various corners of feminist science studies, adjudicated the ontological primacy of a vitalist relational ethics profoundly unable to account for the seemingly disposable lives of the racialized other. However, now, unlike my previous assessments of relationality as this singular salvific ethics for the Anthropocene, I no longer endorse, nor am I convinced with the transformative potential of counter-concept like non-relationality. Rather, I think that today's urgent challenge consists in identifying and tracing the fused form of shared ecological presuppositions across socio-political stratifications and racial environmental vulnerabilities. These demarcations, as I'm now gradually being convinced, are revealing, in turn, the underside of planetary thinking. That is, an inversion within that tacitly regulates how ecological reason fulfills the telos of globalization as it simultaneously cultivates and sustains the moralism and politics of its own counter-hegemonic aspirations. As such, I think that both ecological thought and environmental activism are now tasked more than ever with the imperative to retrieve where and when did the piety of globalization's neoliberal politics converge with the proclaimed radicalness of the various modes of eco-theory's speculative poiesis. In other words, I'm finally more inclined to posit that relationality underwrites non-relationality, that diversity obeys the heuristic of the one, and that eco-criticism's metaphor of entanglements, to use the language of our conveners, restore the many lives of anthropos by repeatedly exhuming the figure of the human. This might sound unnecessarily abstract for the moment, but allow me to clarify by considering one pivotal intervention in Sylvia Wynter's invaluable work. I think it is safe and fair to say that Wynter's extensive body of work is now indispensable in multiple corners of eco-criticism and the environmental humanities. Both powerful in its archival breadth and captivating in the directness of its argumentation style, Wynter's writing and collaborative interviews are mainly informed, I believe, by two overlapping programmatic endeavors. We know, for instance, or we know, of course, that one of Wynter's principal aim is to decenter Europe's biocentric conception of the human, which she argues has forced upon the rest of the world this figure called man as the universal expression of what it means to be human. Let us remember that for Wynter, the goal is to reinvent the human away from Europe's biological and economically overdetermined figure called man, a figure that revealed, as she prophetically read significantly before the climate crisis, became one of academia's main preoccupation. This figure reveals the violent complicities between environmental destruction and the dehumanization of racialized populations across the world. Wherever there is men, Wynter contends, there is violence. It is safe to say, again, that as the concept of the human underwent discursive scrutiny, claims over its abundant shares, however cursed they may be, steadily increased. In this regard, the force of Wynter's text is indisputable, in the extent to which its archaeological Foucauldian overtones lay bare the conditions of emergence of an idiosyncratically Western conception of men as the single representation of the human itself, and keep this human itself, this phrase, in the middle of, write it down, could hardly be made more explicit. Wynter's first sentence, indeed, cuts right to the chase, and this is I will repeat the very long title, but you know which one I'm talking about. The first sentence of that essay, she writes, "The argument proposed," I'm quoting, "the argument proposed that the struggle of our new millennium will be one between the ongoing imperative of securing the well-being of our present ethno-class, i.e. Western bourgeoisie, conception of the human, men, which over-represent itself as if it were the human itself, and that of securing the well-being and therefore the full cognitive and behavioral autonomy of the human species itself, ourselves. A few lines below, I'll quote her again. The correlated hypothesis here is that all our present struggles with respect to race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, struggles over the environment, global warming, etc., I'll jump the rest of them, are all differing facets of the central ethno-class, men versus human struggle. As we know, the ensuing 17 plus pages, in those pages, Winter will then proceed by dissecting the range of historical disposition and theoretical practices that underpin the emergence of a hegemonic conception of the human, its overrepresentation, to use her language. Deemed a struggle previously unnamed, indeed, Winter will unequivocally declare the strife in its critical endeavor. That is, the struggle against this overrepresentation to be the struggle of our time. But what remains interpolating in my perhaps still relatively artificial reading of the text, I don't know, you'll tell me, is not so much that Winter successfully shows that the overrepresentation of a now globally hegemonic ethno-class world of men, this is her language, will vigorously transform and reproduce itself across historical periods, both at the level of discourse and of its institution. Rather, I think that what makes Winter's seminal text perhaps a crucial Anthropocenian palimpsest is its dispositional intuition, according to which there exists necessarily a hierarchical normative opposition between, on the one hand, an imperious conception of the human, and on the other, the human itself. Winter invokes the latter under different names, such as the empirical human world or the human tout court. Without, however, considering the possibility that such a series of designations might, in their relational invocation, represent a conceptual network of metonymic value, that is to say that rather than being merely synonymous with each other, each term and formulation occupies a signifying value in an overdetermined semiotic enclosure. The human and its entire network of related concepts will serve a meta-philosophical function which, in turn, allow Winter and many of her readers to undertake the writing of a different history of the human. In her words, of new forms of life, and these are all used synonymally in my reading, or to use one of her famous reader and interlocutor, Catherine McKittrick, to use her language, livability and possibility. The history of men which Winter traces is clear. She shows that, oh my God, low battery, wow. Are you kidding? See, this is the human, that's what it does. I knew I'm talking shit about it. Yes. She shows that to secure and solidify a secular conception of the human, which will continuously be re-elaborated to suit imperialistic means and ends, modern European society displayed previous understanding of the human from their founding theocentric grips. It is indeed, according to Winter, a conception of the human as sinful by nature that legitimizes clerical imperial expansion. By supernaturalizing modes of being human, the scholastic intelligentsia of medieval Europe did not only solidify its origin narrative by imparting a sovereign will onto the weakness of Adam's previously fallen fragility, the Christianization of the human also legitimized the evangelizing mission by joining the critical power with, the clerical power with the imperial secular state. Winter's text is often read by focusing primarily on her exposition of transformation of the concept of the human across a discursive, historical, political, and spatio-temporal longue durée. I reckon, however, that Winter's most persuasive acumen remains more distinctive in her elaboration of the inscription and reinscription of the model of the human, which will enjoy its most radical fulfillment in our current Anthropocene times. How am I doing with time? So I have 8 minutes? Oh. Well, not technically, because I started after, so I will take those. I absolutely will claim them. The Copernican effect of this enormous, what she calls an enormous act of expression, as she explained, assume a dual form. First, from the Renaissance to the 18th century, humanism's secularizing effort were mainly devoted to reorienting scholastic conception of the human away from their theological underpinning. The second moment of reinvention, one which continues to hold sway in the Anthropocene, established a more radically synthesized construct, which not only relinquished nature's power, the latter, according to Winter, also made possible, quote, the cognitively emancipatory rise and gradual development of the physical sciences and then of the biological sciences, unquote. However, here is the most important part of the argument. At this moment in the text, Winter will then contend that it is indeed the imperial relation between colonizer and colonized that made possible both moments, these two moments of invention and reinvention, inscription and reinscription. And this is why, she continues, one must not overlook the pivotal role that race plays in the substitution of the now secularized concept of man for its previous theological iteration. As she points out, race became the, quote, non-supernatural but no less extra-human ground of the answer that the secularizing West will now give to the Heideggerian question as to the who and the what we are, unquote. The polemic here is deceptively simple. Whereas the normative opposition in medieval Europe, according to her, was organized around distinctions between the untrue Christian and the other, or the normative true Christian self, it is now the dualistic divergence between the racialized human other and the normal human men that define the radical epistemic shift of the modern era, to which, of course, the Anthropocene belongs. This time, however, modernity's descriptive statements find its very physical reference in the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the Caribbean and enslaved Africans newly transported across the Atlantic. This epoch's differential rule of inhabiting the world, as she continues, will construct the enslaved Black African as, quote, the ultimate referent of the radically inferior human other, unquote. A category, she adds, in an otherwise negligible parenthesis, which should also remind us of Achille Mbembe's argument in Critique de la raison nègre, a category which the Black will ultimately be joined by a host of other dark-skinned people, all classified as natives. Winter's point here is that those classified as Black will represent the expression of an indispensable negation, that is, the negation of the human only expressed and embodied by the peoples of the West. That's her language. Well, the peoples of the West. Such negative indispensability will then function both as a heuristic verification, legitimizing the superiority of men, as if, and this is her language again, I mean, the sentence is the over-representation of men as if it were the human, unquote. And this is, I think, her most Foucauldian moment, because you can read all the biopolitical, her biopolitical reading of what she calls the problem of our time, race being the problem of our time. So I am going to skip because I want to say the last part, and I'm almost at the end, yes. But I've always wondered, and I'll try to, I have this whole thing where I'm actually showing her her affinities, which she's never denied, I believe. I mean, her text does not deny it, her affinities with a number of 20th century continental philosophy, namely, particularly Foucault and sometimes Derrida. But I show, like, essentially her own Foucauldian, I would say, tendencies, or I think she likes him. Let me just say that, and then we'll see. But it's obvious that she reads, even in that text, you can see you hear the echoes of the history of madness. But whenever she says men, as Foucault says, I think that even that if I remember, the long epigraph at the beginning of the essay is from The Order of Things. So, I mean, in those moments, Winter traces the concept of race conditions of emergence by invoking a series of contingents, though concrete a priori, which had to be placed had to be in place for Western humanism to become the definition par excellence of the human itself. But unlike Foucault, who believed by 1963, sorry, Elaine, if I'm wrong, but in the birth of the clinic, that one cannot easily describe or transform concrete historical condition, but only perform a fragmented archaeology of the present. Winter's plans are unambiguously prescriptive. To maintain the decisiveness of its claims and its prescriptive possibilities, Winter must set aside the constraint that the archaeological method is only feasibly accomplished retroactively. That is to say, that it is only when a new conception of a phenomenon emerges that one can name the concrete conditions surrounding its emergence, and that, therefore, a telos of transformation is neither available nor readily conceivable as plan or manifesto. That is to say that the battles fought on the grounds of regimes of truth are always already plagued by an irreducible obscurity, which makes the possibility of designing a blueprint for action quasi-impossible, because the concrete contours of the ethical political battle ahead are unavailable, or at the very best, only indistinctly legible. Here it is, hence, not a matter of rediscovering the a priori condition of possibility for any given phenomenon or discursive formation in the context of our subject matter, or my subject matter here. It is not so race or a new human. Yes, in French it says lapsus cubitus, Freudian slip. But you know, in the context of our subject matter today, or well, my subject matter today, the human, it is not a matter of rediscovering the origins of an imperious conception of the human responsible for our current ecological predicament. Rather, an archaeology of Western humanism, if it is at all possible at this moment, I don't know. Well, I don't think so, but yeah. An archaeology of Western humanism would be an occasion to ask on the basis, on what basis the knowledge and the theory of a new humanism become possible. On what basis, therefore, can we think the possibility for both a new humanism and a world otherwise, or an otherwise world? The third event, therefore, Winter's third event, would not depend on our willingness to trace the history of the human, but on our ability to think, perhaps only on our ability to face the historicity of humanism, not as a historical phenomenon, but as a meta-philosophical axiology. What is on trial in the Winterian project, however, is neither the category of the human nor humanism itself, nor even its network of related concepts like life, world, etc. So whereas race function as a historical a priori in the archaeology of Western humanism that Winter traces, the a priori nature of the human itself remains profoundly transcendental. It remains a formal a priori, insofar as it eludes the historicity of this human itself, because the latter is both an indeterminable and unmediated structure, always already operating from above or below the events of its phenomenal articulation. And I'm done, I promise. For what is hardly ever made explicit is whether this human itself is so unique, so unsurpassable, and so imperial in its very nature that it cannot be conceived as another determined structure among many, like race, for instance. Rather, the human appears to be naturalized for Winter, a naturalization which then justifies not only her critique, but the very work of valorization underpinning the efforts at thinking otherwise both the human and its network of related concepts, like world, otherwise world, a ubiquitous formulation in Black Hieroglyph here, I would say. What Winter, therefore, shares with the very discourses she condemns is a humanist consensus about the constitution of the self as first and foremost human tout court. But one could ask, why shall we find ourselves so indebted to the human and its world? What is and to what does an alternative mode of being human resemble? Why must we assume that every culture possesses one for conception, its own conception of the human? Which is also to ask, what makes the order of the human so hermeneutically replicable and therefore translatable across difference? And since her critique of Western humanism is concerned with its totalizing and imperial applicability, one might ask, how does the very category of the human which subtends humanism's condition of operation escape the historicity of the discourse itself? How can the fact of the human be bracketed from the history of its articulations? Could it be that the human, as a metaphysical value beyond the order of meaning, always already initiates the circulation of violent exchanges between difference and differential modes of being? If this is the case, therefore, if that could be the case, that is, human is always violent, so including Winter's human, right? If this is a possibility, could the human be inevitably always already the common ground for all forms of antagonism? And if this antagonism is internally congenital to the essence of the human itself, one will have to wonder whether the structural violence of Western humanism, which Winter and others condemn, myself included, has neither specificity nor privilege over all other forms of violence. And that is indeed a frightening thought which I think we probably have to face, especially today, precisely because it haunts and continues to haunt all critical project in the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Excel. Okay, we have...
0 minutes.
No, we have more than 0 minutes. We have 5 or 6 minutes for questions. So who has questions? Yes. Microphone's coming.
Thank you, Axel, for your talk. I'll try to make this as brief as possible. I would be interested in hearing you talk a bit more about how do you see the possibility or impossibility of integrating or approaching Winter's work with, for briefness' sake, competent environmental philosophy that build back to the problem that Whitehead described as the bifurcation of nature, but precisely integrating this part that should have never been left out, which is Winter's critique, especially how she articulates it in 1492, this intervention, the European invasion of America, rewriting what it means to be a human in the world, and this possibility of the recreation of it. So in the sense, since this part of history and of our story is so crucial to understand whatever modernity is, contemporary environmental philosophy that is so geared towards this critique of modernity precisely, how should it or must it integrate Winter's work to properly do its critical work?
How should it?
Yeah, how do you see this possibility or impossibility?
I mean, it already is. I mean, Winter is like literally the new Fanon, you know. Every epoch in professional philosophy has its, inducted Black. She is this time. I mean, in eco-criticism, I would say, And it was the same with Fanon when I was, in school before I did this to myself, But so it already is happening, and I think most of them, and it's not happening. Interestingly enough, I think folks who, the interventions who are using Winter, I would count them in this group that you're calling, at least in the contemporary heirs of what we call modern theory. Can we agree? Catherine Yusuf, should I just go through all most of them are readers of a very specific generation of the French 60s, let's say, sometimes the Germans. But, so I would say that that's already happening. But the reason why I brought Fanon, this was just not a cheeky thing, you know, it's because what I'm seeing actually, it's the same thing that happened with Fanon when I was in grad school. I mean, like, I think I might be the last generation that had to deal with that, where, you know, again, that is, I hate to sound too Derridian here, but, you know, that is the autoimmunity of, you know, diversity and inclusion, I would say projects, imposed projects on sometimes departments like philosophers were forced to read, they were like, oh, you know, institutional, you have to catch up with the time. There has to be one black, one woman. I mean, I won't tell the story, well, I can tell you where it happened. No, I won't tell you where it happened because then you'll find out where, but like I do know, like, I was not young, but I was still a student. I heard someone say, well, you know, like, yeah, I just put on Butler there and, you know, and a little bit of Fanon, and yeah, got it. Syllabus is over, you know? So that what I was actually seeing with, and I'm not saying all of the interventions in, I'm just gonna call them continental philosophy to just be, you know, for simplicity's sake. What I was seeing in continental philosophers' intervention, or at least their reading of Fanon, was extremely instrumentalized. So it didn't really look like, you know, what Hegel taught us all to do, you know, before we refute, you better get into the text. No, you don't get into the text, you just pluck it to text. I don't know, it's almost like you don't even, you know, it's like sense certainty. Sorry, I've been like teaching the phenomenology, so I'm like a little bit, but you know, like, it's like that intuitive apprehension. There's just, oh yes, I see a word there, I could use that part and, you know, and pluck it in my argument without really thinking and reading the text in its own term, right? So what you do is that there are no critical engagement with Winter today. So I think that happened with Fanon for a long time. I would say, you know, with respect to one or two people, I'd say like maybe David Merritt has changed the tide a little bit, has forced philosophers to change a little bit the tide. But I would say that the same thing is happening with Winter, and somebody's going to have to do it with Winter, because the thing is, again, I'm just trying to be nice. I just think that, I'm not going to say names or whatever, but I just think that there's an instrumentalization of Winter's work that refuses to take her, that refuses to read her, right? And essentially she becomes almost like a, you know, it's like a puzzle that you could put in wherever you see fit, right? I mean, I will say that like, about 90%, that I will say, 90%, because you read it in my book, 90% of the argument of, a million black Anthropocene or none, I just don't understand the correlation between her indictment of geology and black feminism. I don't get it. Like, I mean, there is like a click where it's just what's happening, you know? So, I think that the beginning would have to do the kind of homework that I think is done in the other direction, right? So, because for instance, I am not sure, and because there's a winter of the 90s, and then there was the winter of the 70s, where this analogy, this operative analogy between humanism and men actually isn't. I mean, it's not as overstated as it has, and also it has been kind of like entrenched by questionable readers. Not questionable readers in Black studies. So yeah, so it would be like a mission of, or going back to learning how to read, I guess.
Thank you. I've got my eye on the clock. Can you hold your question, and we'll get back to it when we have some open discussion at the end. There's a lot of questions here still to come. Thank you so much, Excel.
Oh, so yeah. I don't need this anymore.
Okay, our fourth speaker for this afternoon is Dr. Lynn Huffer, who is a Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor at Emory University. She's published research on the Anthropocene, on auto theory, on Foucault, on feminist theory, queer theory, and ethics. She is the author of 6 books. These books include a trilogy on Foucault's ethics of Eros, beginning with Mad for Foucault in 2010, Are the Lips a Grave, 2013, and Foucault's Strange Eros in 2020. She has 2 earlier books on feminist theory, Maternal Pasts, Feminist Futures in 1988, and Another Colette in 1992. Her latest book is a collage-style work in fragments, which we're going to see some today, that brings together philosophy, memoir, poetry, and original multimedia artworks. This book is out with Duke University Press in May of this year, and it is called These Survivals, Autobiography of an Extinction. Dr. Huffer has held writers' residencies at the Ragdale Foundation in Lake Forest, Illinois, at the Brush Creek Foundation for the Arts in Saratoga, Wyoming, at the Hamdage Centre in Dillard, Georgia, and at the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, France. She was a member in 2022 to 2023 of the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She has also co-produced with Chicago artist Jennifer York a limited edition collaborative artists book called Wading Pool that is available through Vamp and Tramp booksellers. Dr. Huffer's paper today is titled Idiorhythmy. Lynn.
Great. Can you all hear me? Is this okay? Okay. Thank you so much, Elizabeth Wilson, and thank you to the Pembroke Center and to all of you for coming. I know some of you have been here from the beginning and appreciate your patience. So my remarks today come from over a decade of thinking and writing about the so-called Anthropocene, and driven by an increasing interest in fragments and fragmentation has really led me, I think, to the limits of legibility, and so it's very much in sync with the theme of this series. So I want to start by going back for a moment to an essay I published a decade ago, Foucault's Fossils. In that essay, I used Foucault to critique the new vitalisms of contemporary eco-criticism and eco-philosophy. I focused specifically on the return to nature and life itself in a range of renaturalizing feminist philosophies as well as some queer theory. The essay engages Foucault's uptake of Georges Cuvier, the so-called father of paleontology, and it revisits the archive through the lens of deep time, where the fossil record tracks the extinction of species, and where Cuvier reconceives the earth with its fossils as, quote, nature's archive. So here the fossil, a fragment, emerges as form against an illegible background of extinctions that evade meaning, what Foucault calls variously monstrosity or the lacunary reserve. Thinking the fossil in this way in our present time of mass species extinctions compelled me to experiment with fragmentation, with the fragmentation of form we see in the Earth archive. So in 2020, in the midst of COVID, then 2021, January 6th, it felt a bit like it does now, like the world is coming apart. And intuitively, I met this blown apart feeling with a fragmenting practice of my own, a kind of counter-fragmentation. I started collaging, cutting up images, gluing them back together again, always analog, never digital. And this aesthetic practice was also a practice of thinking. I started reading about fragments from aesthetic, philosophical, and historical perspectives, from ancient Greece to Noah Purifoy's Desert Art Museum of Assemblage Art and Lorena Grady's haiku diptychs, cutting out the New York Times. This is reflected on a page of my journal from December 2020, where I constructed one of my early collages called Sapphobot. It features images of a Sapphobot, which is a Twitter account that tweeted a fragment of Sappho every 2 hours, using the English translations and formatting from Anne Carson's If Not Winter, Fragments of Sappho. With tens of thousands of followers, every tweet became a kind of island of intensification, often with hundreds of retweets of a single word, so something like sweet bitter or a phrase, thought barefoot. If Carson's book of translations turned torn scraps of Sapphic papyri into something like a whole, a totality, so a codex between covers, Sapphobot broke them apart again. Twitter is not a codex. It offered up Sappho as a new kind of text, broken pieces of text surrounded by a bracketed blank space that jolted smartphone users out of that familiar trance induced by a constant stream of news and opinions and cat photos. My analog collage scattered and gathered the digital Sapphobot, centering an analog photo of my mother as a child in a bathtub, repeating these fragments of Sappho, thought barefoot, led astray, you will go your own way among dim shapes, I will go, and on the bottom right here, ek pepo temena, a word Carson translates as having been breathed out. On the other side of my journal page, you can see me scribbling, wrestling with the philosophy of the fragment through a text by Blanchot, Fragment Word, about the notoriously difficult 20th century French poet René Char. Through Char, Blanchot contests how we commonly think the fragment by implicitly referencing the whole it is not, the speculative whole out of which it must have been extracted, like a severed finger that refers back to the hand. Fragment word, parole de fragment, Blanchot writes, a term that is hard to approach. Fragment, a noun, but possessing the force of a verb that is nonetheless absent. And then here's the bit that's inside that shard at the center of the page. Whoever says fragment ought not to say simply the fragmenting of an already existent reality or the moment of a whole still to come. This is hard to envisage. The only knowledge is knowledge of the whole, something that has previously been or will subsequently be a whole. In the juxtaposition of fragments Blanchot describes in Char's poetry, we find a refusal of any reference to a whole still to come. Char's phrases, rather than being coordinated, are posed one next to the other. Through Char, Blanchot calls upon speech to respond to the nature of the human being, quote, in interval and as though suspended, unquote. In this sense, Blanchot suspends the human by rewriting the relation of the fragment to whole through what he calls Char's poetic speech as archipelago, cut up into the diversity of its islands, and thus causing a surging of the great open sea, this ancient immensity, the unknown always still to come, designated for us only by the emergence of the Earth's infinitely divided depths. That cutting up of speech into islands of meaning posed next to one another describes a logic of juxtaposition at the limits of legibility. Like the relation of the fossil to the monstrous lacunary reserve it opens in Foucault, here the cut of speech causes a surging of the great open sea, an unknown always still to come. And to practice this relation of the fragment to the unknown, the severed finger without the hand, feels like falling into deep time, falling into what Blanchot calls the Earth's infinitely divided depths. In The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, Dipesh Chakrabarty describes this as an abyssal fall that shifts our relation to the planet, what we always conceived of as the background or stage on which or against which human action, human history unfolds. With climate crisis, Chakrabarty writes, the background is no longer just background, we are a part of it. He describes this as an experience of falling into the planet, into planetary time. I had fallen into deep history, he writes, into the abyss of deep geological time. And for me, that fall into the background, into the unstable substrate of planetary time has brought forth fragments, like fossils emerging from sediment. What was background is now foreground, but broken into pieces. Staying with or in that fragmented foreground in the mode of Blanchot has required a different writing practice, a different way of working with thought. This experimental practice, extreme montage, has included not only collaging, but also erasure poetry, haikus, artist books, text image assemblages, Oulipian writing generated by constraint, the amplification of blank space on the page, obsessive redeployments of the brackets Anne Carson inserts into her translations of Sappho, writing in columns, recursive self-writing in a broken mirror that undoes me, a practice of thinking that privileges juxtaposition over continuity. Extracted from a philosophical substrate of concepts, the creation of fragments interrupts the abstractions of concept-making activities. In that sense, the practice is counter-conceptual. Its sensibilities more poetic than philosophical. Its slogan, less is more. These practices generated a book, these survivals, and something more than a book, installations. 2 years ago, I was on leave, participating in a seminar on climate crisis at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. I was writing a book, not the one I ended up with. It wasn't coming together, and out of sheer frustration and totally destructive fit, I started cutting up, tearing up printed pages, scribbled notes, numbered lists, quotes, images, drawings, dress patterns. Proust famously compared writing to making a dress. With blue painter's tape, I mounted these vestiges of my destructive fit onto the walls of my living space. But the two-dimensional format offered by those walls only intensified this frustration. As if in a dream, I started fragmenting the fragments, printing out more pages and cutting them up, gluing them onto index cards, stringing together feathers with dried leaves and scraps of scribbled paper. I found coils of brown twine tucked away in the bottom of my toolbox. Unspooling the twine, I zigzagged lines across most of the apartment, eye level above my head, at the hips, then affixed these bits and bobs to them. I really didn't know what I was doing. The lines grew of their own accord. They were alive. They took over my living space, utterly consuming me. The twine, vine-like, kept sprouting fragments, more and more fragments, whose restless energy I could feel pulsing beneath those tiny clothespins that I used. When colleagues and friends stopped by or came to visit, they said it felt like entering a three-dimensional collage. It's an art installation, they kept saying. Those encounters transformed the chaotic shards of my own mind into something I reluctantly agreed to call an installation. My idiosyncratic installation of thoughts, installation of myself, became something more, not only a confluence of lines, but a murmur of voices and a play of contingencies, accidental, impermanent, not self, A book was born from this relation with others, these survivals, autobiography of an extinction. In writing the self, this autobiography, the self disappeared. Unspooling lines turned the self into fragments, saying the self unsaid her. Self disappeared in the moment of her appearance as self-writing form, autobiography of an extinction. I didn't know it then, but the installation in my New Jersey apartment was the beginning of a series. I received some invitations, one from Duke, another from Bryn Mawr College last spring, where I did a 3-day residency that included collective writing, collaging, and experimentation with text-image juxtapositions that combined art with philosophy to generate over 100 additional fragments integrated into the original elements of my New Jersey apartment installation. So these installations kept returning to me, to others, in a recursive temporality that Nietzsche calls the eternal recurrence, that Foucault calls the time of unreason. And in each installation, something untimely returns. Fragments of the past pop into the present to disrupt it. Time activates space. Space activates time. In each instance, with every installation, spatial fragmentation also generates temporal breaks that crack open the epistemic substrate of the present. Cracked and broken, the rifted present becomes something to be disassembled and reworked. Again and again, participants tell me that these childlike aesthetic practices, cutting things up and gluing them back together again, shake up how they know, how they think, how they feel the present. They become philosopher-artists in the zone, like children. I call these practices thought collage, working with a fractured substrate that allows something untimely, something fresh to happen. These installations are as fleeting as laundry on lines, flying, fluttering, having been breathed out, ek pepotimena. Like painting with water, they are exercises in impermanence. If the object called a book, these survivals, makes it feel like something has coalesced, as installation, the book disperses. But what was scattered gathers. What was gathered blows apart. These words from Heraclitus open my book. Strange, sweet, bitter paradox, which, as Carson puts it in her reading of Sappho's Fragment 31, can split the mind in two. My book, These Survivals, is no longer mine. It endures beyond me, not as an object that outlives me, but as a stuttering practice of friendship in fragments. That practice is driven by another paradox. The book's endurance as a practice is a function of its incompletion. In its repeated renewal as yet another installation, the book, These Survivals, becomes a temporary movement of fragments gathering and scattering again. The fragment endures while the whole crumbles. And there's an ethics in this, ethics in the doing and the making and unmaking, ethics as friendship, as a practice in relation to others. This making and unmaking cultivates important ethical capacities, patience, a willingness to wait, an openness to not knowing, an embrace of experiments that fail, more patience, being with others in creative activity, finding joy in the midst of planetary, governmental, existential distress, in the making and unmaking of something new, in the making and unmaking of ourselves in it. These embodied, fleshy, analog practices, fingers sticky with glue, created a book and its book-dispersing afterlives as installations far beyond my New Jersey apartment. As relations with others, these installations are collective practices that intensify the experience of creation in impermanence. They are trainings for survival in a time of extinction. Idiorhythmy. I get the title of my talk from that word, trainings, as Roland Barthes describes it in his 1977 Collège de France lecture course, How to Live Together. There, Barthes contrasts training with the more common term, method. Method, he says, is the straight path that enters into the service of a generality, a morality. Barthes queerly invokes training, the paideia of the Greeks, as a kind of dispatching along an eccentric path stumbling among snatches between the bounds of different fields of knowledge, flavors. And for me, such training means stumbling like Barthes, falling like Chakrabarti, and then getting up again and again and again. But unlike the Greek path of paideia that leads into the light of the philosopher king, the cave, out of the cave, here in this training, there's no leaving the cave. We are geological, the Pleistocene, the Pyrocene, the acidification of oceans, the alteration of atmosphere. We are in the planet, in the cave, where anthropoi are chained, mesmerized by the ever-proliferating images of ourselves we see flickering on our smartphone screens. There's no going up out of this. The fall into planetary time is both singular and collective. I, with others, in a beat Barthes calls idiorhythmy, from idios, particular, and rhythmos, rhythm. Practices of solitude in the midst of communal life, playing with what Barthes calls the fugitivity of the code. These installations for survival, what we're left with, where I disappear, reflect an idiorhythmic need for solitude in community in planetary time. Living together isn't easy. Fragments mark the tug of these idiorhythmic survivals, their conflicts and difficulties, their passions and disappointments, our dread, our fragile endurance. So in the time I have left, I'll just read a few excerpts from the book, These Survivals. Its movement is captured by something Foucault once said. In the opening words of his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, Foucault confesses that he longs to become not a famous speaker, but a caesura, a slender gap, a thin lacuna, une mince lacune, in a path of speech. So my book is a collage thick with borrowed words and images, and yet it gapes open, it empties itself out. I like to imagine it as an idiorhythmic gap, a pause, a thin lacuna, a caesura, in a present that often suffocates and overwhelms us. Okay, so here's a bit from These Survivals, and the book has 3 parts: fragments coming back, in the middle, in the dark between us, and décollage. And I'll just give you some snippets from each part of the book. So, from part 1, fragments coming back. A rule for writing: don't say Anthropocene. The word sags from overuse. Unsay Anthropocene with a Holocene fragment. Anne Carson coming back in her Oresteia, here in her translation of Agamemnon. Words are coined by pressing old words together into new compounds. Day visible coming back, light bringing coming back, dream visible, man-minded coming back, dew-drenched, hair devouring, crimson covered, coming back, purple paved, red saturated, grief remembering pain, coming back. The coming back fragment endures. Its endurance not steady, not continuous, not a line across a page, but lines that break. Returning across a page or a space for living in coming back time, not the time of madness, but the time of unreason. Like speech that unsays by saying, the fragment endures while the whole crumbles. Breath mark, Luft pause. If you're singing or talking, wind instrument, take a breath. This is not a comma, respite. The fragment endures while the whole crumbles. It is the whole that is fragile, transitory. Another rule for writing: it's okay to say I, but let her scatter. She was already scattered. Wearing nothing but a shirt, she and I, Sapphic, would have been condemned, along with Damians, sodomites, witches, mystics, and heretics, to be consumed by fire, ashes thrown to the wind. We admire a text because it scatters well, like ashes strewn to the wind. An inspiration, Hannah Hook, cut with a kitchen knife data through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch of Germany, 1919. Borrowing her kitchen knife, perfect Sapphic collagist's tool, before splicing and gluing comes cutting, domestic, recalling the dark of a Paris theater, first time seeing Jeanne Dillman, 23 Quai du Commerce, 1080, Bruxelles, falling in love at the end, with this caesura in domestic order, after being stuck in real time, unbearable, will this ever end? 3 hours of repetitive tasks, peeling potatoes, setting the table, shining shoes, putting them on a shelf, pushing back a chair with a swing of the hip, breading veal, buttoning a shirt. Always the same, peel, set, shine, put, push, bread, button, peel, set, shine, put, push, bread, button, peel, set, shine, put, push, bread, button, set, bread, button, and then suddenly the cut, décollage, not the knife, but its anticipation. An inner abyss gapes open when Jeanne misses a button and the audience gasps. On January 6th, the mob comes, blinding white. Some move in tight formation in tactical gear. Others come bearing flagpoles, zip ties, bear spray, crutches. Everything becomes a weapon, a defiance of authority, scorching rage. The crowd burns. A retired firefighter throws a fire extinguisher at Capitol Police, cracks open Brian Sicknick's skull, fatal. Someone parades a Confederate flag across the antique mosaic floor. Someone else wears a Camp Auschwitz shirt. Outside, makeshift gallows stand, complete with sturdy wooden steps and the noose. Robert Sanford, Kevin Seafried, Robert Keith Packer. All night long, I'm aware of evildoing. To break into tears seems the right verb, shattered and scattered into the nation. Into language of cry, into language that breaks open like data in the desert. These coming back fragments of a body politic, not whole, never was, just nation, imagination for some, for many not nation, never was. A childhood friend says the world is changing for the better. Look at all the women getting elected, she says. Women are different, more peaceful. AOC hid in Katie Porter's office, terrified, lights out, no talking. She borrowed a staffer's athletic shoes in case she had to run. The vile King's mob would have killed her if they'd found her. The crowd was cheered on by another woman elected by Georgians, sisterhood forever, add women and stir feminism. Equality means women can now hunt like men. Marjorie Taylor Greene is on the hunt, scanning the heavens for Jews with laser beams or prowling the underbrush for Satanists, pedophiles, and lizard people. Many members of Congress are afraid to be in the building with her. Chop, chop, snip, snip, jab, jab, a tear here, a cut there. I light a match to edge the paper with bright flame. Poof, fire goes out, dark ash floats in the air. This counter-chopping and scorching feels like respite. I dab glue over burnt shapes. Gently, with great care, I pretend to put the world back together again. There's a space where a thought would be, but which you can't get hold of. I love that space. If you're singing or talking, take a breath. The fragrant bosomed lovely gifts, girls, clear melodious lyre, body old age now, my hair is turned instead of dark. Sappho is to Plato as fragment is to whole. Fragment is to whole as particular is to general. Particularities endure while generalities crumble. So much for metaphysics. A space where a thought would be, love that space. Part 2, in the middle, in the dark, between us. The last time I heard you, you said, I will go, yet here you are again, led astray, why again? Coming back fragment, trying to say something, trying to unsay it. One of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. I cut you with a kitchen knife, glued you to white paper, the very last page, in my own cloth-bound psalter. I made you during COVID and the first reign of Donald the Bad. Now you're back, looking at you again on the internet, cloisters.com, going and meeting you in person at the cloisters. On a hill above the Hudson, on a code-red smoke day, Gallery 13, Bun de Luxembourg's prayer book. Printing you out again dozens of times, cutting you up again, gluing you back together again, hanging you from clotheslines, again, making you my own again, sapphic, in all the ways historical you can imagine. In Delhi, the vultures are gone, and now kites soar like flying lizards, and on red zone days, they plummet from the sky like meteors. Part 3, décollage. Prostration, like a cat rubbing up against your leg. Making garments against women, she learned the key to everything was not the time spent on the machine, but the time spent with a needle in hand. Needle means scissors, glue stick, ink. Fragments composed in multiple stages. Rough copy, overcooked, thrown wet spaghetti at a wall, start somewhere, see what sticks. Scribbles, paper scraps, painter's tape, patterns, erasures, numbers, quotes, rules, poems, Proustian paperos, so beautiful to look at, no longer care what they say. My own assiduously composed scholar prose hacked to pieces. And then, one night, a new constellation zigzagged its way across my study, assiduous spider, dragline silk, cross-beaming structures for images and letters. But strung up, painter-taped, or glued into a book with a chopped-out spine for these tattered garments, feral fragilité, these collages beyond saving, less nouns and more verbs, prostrations and offerings, cat rubbing against your leg, these beloved verbs enduring while nouns crumble. Forms, nouns, do not matter in themselves. Rub, verb, early 14th century, rubbin, to apply friction to a surface, like cat pheromones leaving their scent. Possession feels like love. I know that smell. On dress pattern, cat cutout, yellow onion skin, tissue paper, glue, chanced upon in the kitchen, embroidery thread, butcher paper, white ink, black ink, gold ink, silver ink, fruit netting white, fruit netting red, New Yorker typeface, masking tape, more painter's tape, scotch tape, artist tape, weather report, writing, fancy tape gifted from a student, corrugations, ink, magic markers, newsprint already yellowed, blue sheets of plastic, New York Times headlines, dirt-darkened string, musky fur from the IAS woods, rusted Brillo pad, jute, fibers, seed pods, sequins and glitter and spangles and stickers and decimated books for altering, prostrations for survival. One day, perhaps, we will no longer know what this was. No archival box will preserve this scent, these rubbings. Weird anarchic portrait, weird history of a present in a Dada junkyard, weird saphobotic speech, weird mysterical prayer to some secular God not God. Kites fall like fragments from the skies of Delhi. In a basement, they repair a wing. Fragments may endure, but the whole crumbles, inexorable, unhumaning, holocenic décollage. Gaps gape like missed buttonholes, 9 planetary boundaries like line breaks in earth, sea, sky, desert, data beat, drumming vestibular fields and domestic interiors. But where the lines break, in the break, impossible to say, deep sound. Sapphic fragments lack precision. A single square bracket gives the impression of missing matter, or these brackets cannot track every thinking, feeling, grief, remembering, every disappearance, a blizzard of marks. Every emptying cannot be told, yet must be told, but only through its untelling. We do not need a doctor to say dance, dance, dance before the song runs out. There's an ethics in this, uncovering moral cover stories, hacking them to pieces, ungrasping, ungrabbing, unraveling substrate, this end of the world, collaging the practice of a childlike mind. Proust placard rolled in a tube, no longer legible, and Whitewood's fur in a tube, I know that smell. Like a paintbrush or Proust-ended blade for beheading, la patte du peintre. Mind turning, like the mind of a new-caught animal. Child mind, scatter mind, thought-feeling mind, everyday minded minding of the ills of a planet, or just a gaggle, or a crowd, or a flock holding on, or a herd dying. Species extinguishing, impossible to see. How to everyday mind this extinction. Child-minded mind, an adult growing down, losing words. Wah, I'm speechless, but heart still full to overflowing. But Dawn stood speechless at the last gate, for as she looked at the old friends beside her and the new ones before her, her heart was full to overflowing, and her thoughts, like the world about her, were golden with the joy of a new day. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. Cadence, cadere, to fall. Rhythm of her voice, find light there now in a youth poet laureate's cadence. Brave enough to see it, brave enough to be it, just now gold-sandaled dawn. Spangled is the earth with her crowns. To hold, spangled. And I, not so famous, unlike inaugurating sweet poet voice, I speech scatters, becoming speechless at the gate, another day, cracking open an empty page, picking up pen, knife and glue, or strange fur-tufted Proust tube for painting or beheading, and lodging myself, ever scattering, in the breach, bone-valleyed, in the middles, in the darks, with others whispering, idiorhythmic. These survivals gathering as I pause. Wah, I'm speechless. Arrows flown, missed buttonholes, all that breathes, slender gaps in all those paths of speech, light strands and dark strands, flying, fluttering, breathing this earth, my darling one, ekpepo temena. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. We have 10 or 12 minutes for questions. Who would like to start us off? Excel? Yeah?
Thank you so much, Lynn. I have two questions. One is just completely out of curiosity. I'm just wondering what didn't work with the first book.
What didn't work?
Yeah, well, like what created that crisis, which then, I say this because I was very much interpolated by the conversation between Dixa and Thangam around dismemberment.
Around?
Dismemberment.
Dismemberment.
Because Dixa, I mean, like part of what Dixa showed us is this kind of like a non-mechanistic understanding of the body, which almost, dismembers the body that isn't there. I just don't want to say a body without organ. You see what I mean? Like, but like an absent.
Yeah.
Like, a kind of like a materialism that is not mechanistic per se, but maybe something like living consciousness. And Dix's scene was the shamanic, and then Thangam, if I remember the conversation, was about literature, poetry, being also this place where, the kind of like well-order, materialists, mechanistic order, a coherent, cohesive material mechanism or materialistic mechanism can be sustained. I mean, like, gets dismembered, so to speak. So I wonder what got dismembered, or rather if this new project is a result of the dismembering of the first one, and what was it? Was it, because there's something quite, I wouldn't say shamanic, because I don't know, I don't know that tradition, but I would say that, I don't know, I'll come out a little bit, say, I'm spiritual enough to say that there are experiences, certainly, that I can recognize in the cutting up, as in the experiences that don't really belong to you, that are sort of like forced upon you. Like, for instance, throwing out a book, after years of working on it. So I was if you see what I mean, like I see a connection between that conversation and what actually happened to your attempt at, at putting together a well-organized, traditional academic book, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, I think, so just on a really basic level, I continually felt this tension in writing about something in a form that was so at odds with what I was actually describing. And it just felt increasingly untenable for me. And, you know, I was at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is such an amazing place and a huge privilege. And one of my colleagues there just said, why don't you just give yourself permission to just make a book of fragments? And, you know, I'm 64 years old, I've written many books, and it's like, I'm gonna just do this. So part of it is like just the passage of time, you know, and having done a lot of scholarly books and wanting to try something new. But also feeling that there was something more honest in the fragmentation. Yeah.
Do you think that this is almost like an inevitable burden or condition of the eco-critic? Because, because it didn't happen with your Foucault book, and it happened with many other things. Is it the climate crisis, or is it this this crisis that is undoing or dismembering conventional notion of subjectivity, which are making, you know, academic writing hard, for instance?
Yeah,
you know, so
for sure. And I mean, I've always like been about undoing the subject. Like I've never believed in the subject ever. So even in my very like scholarly books, I'm always writing about whatever you want to call it, you know, the death of the subject or whatever. But I felt, so I do think there is something about not just eco-criticism, but specifically working on extinction and working on fossils and paleontology and thinking about the archive in that Foucauldian way, but also thinking about other kinds of archives and all the work that's been done on archives by various people, and trying to find different forms and, you know, teaching about that a lot. My teaching has really influenced me a lot as well. But yeah, there's definitely something about working on deep time, which also makes the human completely insignificant, right? Paleontology, climate crisis, my background in like weird French literature. Also more and more seeing Foucault, who I've worked on more than anybody, as somebody who actually is a collagist. I actually think that's the way he structures his arguments, is through juxtaposition. And I think that has to do with his archival method. And so I just became increasingly interested in it, not just as an aesthetic form, but as a different way of thinking that opens, it's like the juxtaposition of two things. At the edge where they touch, it opens something up that wouldn't be opened up otherwise if you just have the clean arc of continuity that you create when you make an argument. And so that, yeah, it involved dismemberment, and the literary, as you said, becomes really important in that as well. So even though I'm in a philosophy department, as you know, my training is more literary, and so I think literature opens up possibilities of experimentation with form that is also in the history of philosophy, right? And that can be recuperated in different ways. Thanks.
Yeah, Lynn.
Hi.
Hi.
Is it this on? Thank you so much. That was totally amazing and fascinating. I am always a little bit uncomfortable with the discourse of unlearning things, because I feel like, I don't know if it's because of sort of my belief that, well, not my belief, but psychoanalysis's belief that the unconscious always remembers everything, that nothing is gone from there, or that the idea of unlearning to me always seems like it's based on, in a way, a kind of disavowal, that, you know, the thing that supposedly is unlearned is still always there, haunting, but you're pretending it doesn't. So I really appreciated that what you were talking about was sort of not pretending not to remember, but dismembering and scattering and redistributing and, you know, all of these other ways of sort of playing with it. But you did also at some moments talk about unlearning. So I'm curious how you see those things in relationship to one another, right? Because I feel like that work of scattering that you did, I mean, it's just incredible. So I just would love to hear the way you think about those things in relationship to one another.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your question. And, you know, I'm going to have to go back and see when I say unlearning, because I think I agree with you about that. No. And it's because I actually completely agree with what you said about it. And so for me, it really is dismembering rather than not remembering. But it's also the saying and the unsaying is really important. I mean, it's apophatic speech, right? So it's speech that unsays by saying, right? And so it's a paradoxical speech, which to me is different than unlearning, right? So it's a form of speech that stutters, that the more it tries, it's a recursive kind of speech, because the more it tries to say, it keeps unsaying itself. And so it's also a kind of, I think of it as a self-hollowing speech, which to me is different than unlearning, right?
Yeah, that's why I find it so moving.
But thank you for the question. I'm going to think about the unlearning and look at my manuscript, which I can't change anymore. But
Well, you can cut it up again when you get it. Do we have one more question? And I'm going to get everyone, actually, do you all want to come up at this point?
Yeah.
Excel, yeah. Do we have another question here? Yes, go, yeah.
Is this for me or the group?
Hang on to the group question. Lynn, as you're sitting down, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to abuse my position as chair. You said something, I think it might have been in relation to the translation of the Sappho fragments, that they split the mind in two. Which I think might relate a little bit to what you were just talking about. Can you say something about the resistance? I know that you've experienced a bit of a resistance to fragmentation from your students. Do you want to say a little bit more about the refusal to be fragmented?
Are you thinking about that one student that I told you?
Yes, I'm not going to repeat that story. We are being...
So I often give my students collaging assignments, and I'm inspired by experimental practices by groups like Oulipo, which is this French group, you know, that uses constraint to generate stuff. And so I have my student, they can make their own collage, like I'm teaching Intro to Feminist Philosophy. They can make their own collage, but they also have to draw an image and some text out of the bag randomly, and they have to include it in their collage, right? So there's this constraint of this thing that they didn't choose that they have to include in their collage. And one of the students drew the lines from Sappho, thought barefoot, and she just like completely freaked out. Like she's like, what does this mean? You know, she just like refused to include it, you know? And so there definitely is, I think, a resistance to fragmentation, because it can be very disempowering, perhaps. Or it's just so at odds with how people are used to engaging with language.
Yeah, and so maybe this...
And it does split the mind in two, and I think the mind being split in two is not always a pleasant experience.
No, usually not. And I think maybe this returns me a little bit to what Excel was talking about the resurgence of a certain kind of humanism, that student is sticking to her humanisms. We started a little late, so we're going to take 15 minutes of questions at this point, just to the group as a whole. So if you would like to kick us off, that would be great. And actually, do you know what I'm going to do? Is I'm going to get all three questions together, and we'll just open to the floor.
Thank you for the presentations. This is for the latter half. I'm curious, one, Axel, about your question that you proposed about the void. Maybe could you talk a little bit more about why you chose that title? And I'm also curious about, perhaps do you see that in Winter's earlier works? Might we take Lynn's call for this perhaps fragmentation to perhaps read Winter prior to that moment where we see the humanism in a certain manner kind of emerge out of her work?
Thank you. So we'll just take these questions together, and then I'll come to you. Yeah. So, yep.
Thank you. So these are also two, hopefully, short questions. And they both have to do with the position of the critic, thinking about this, the space of critique and who is the eco-critic. The first one has actually to do with the abstract, the presentation for this colloquium, the idea that the eco-critic is seduced. I would be interested in hearing from you an elaboration on this in the sense of who is doing this seducing, the fact that the idea of seduction implies a certain naivete on the part of the eco-critic, and that us here, or at least the panel, is in a sort of external position to this seducing, has a certain of better outlook into what is happening. So that is my first question. And the second one has to do with something, with a word that appeared tangentially in everyone's presentations, which was the Anthropocene. And the question has to do with, because for the last 20 years, of course, humanity and eco-criticism, the humanities and eco-criticism specifically, have engaged with the discussions of the Anthropocene. But I would be interested in hearing you, how is it necessary to update this discussion now in face of the fact that, because the humanities had a sort of field day saying that the sciences want to impose upon us this concept of the Anthropocene coming from, et cetera, a lot of things that everyone knows. But what happened last year was that the Anthropocene working group was fully ignored by geological establishment, and the proposal wasn't even read, and it was simply ignored. And the Anthropocene working group became a sort of rogue geologist group. So I would be interested in hearing from you the sort of position that the humanities have taken in relation to this scientific concept, and the fact that for geological establishment, this was considered an affront, the very proposal of the Anthropocene.
That's great. Can you pass it back to Harper? And then what I'll do once you ask your question, Harper, is Len, I'm just going to start with you, and I'm just going to work our way around for just comments, right? Oh. Yeah. Not right now, but Harper's got a question.
Thank you so much for wonderful talks. I have one question for Professor Carrera specifically, and then one for you and Professor Huffer. The first is, could you maybe say a little bit about how your very incisive and smart critique of the human, the kind of transcendental status of the human itself in Winter bears on your move away from non-relation since Blackness and the Pitfalls of Anthropocene Ethics, and then also if maybe both of you could reflect on the status of itself. I know you mentioned the kind of move towards life itself in eco-criticism, and yeah, what is this itself doing, and maybe what can we do with it?
That's terrific. Thank you. Okay. So Len, Excel, Dixa, JT, go at it.
Yeah, I actually, in terms of the position of the critic, I definitely don't see myself as somehow knowing more than somebody else or being less seduced. It's just not something that I think, and it's one of the reasons I do these collaborative installations, right? Because I feel like this is something that we're all in together, and we're all immersed in it, and there's no standing outside of it. So that's just how I see myself. In terms of geologists and the Anthropocene, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely aware of all of the debates within geology and the fact that it was what happened last year. And I've actually been in this reading group for 15 years now with a bunch of scientists. It's our Anthropocene reading group. And it's been interesting to have these conversations with scientists because they ask just really completely different questions. And it's true that they don't love the term Anthropocene. I don't love it either, and yet it has this tenacity. And so I've actually come to see it as a kind of catachresis, It's just like this figural term that does different kinds of work in different contexts, for which there is no literal term. It's a catachresis. That's how I see the Anthropocene. Yeah. And then the life itself, yeah. So, I mean, I mostly get my critique of life itself from Foucault's The Order of Things, where he says life was invented in the 19th century, and then in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, he says, sex itself is this speculative ideal that comes out of the dispositif of sexuality, right? And so I do see this idea of life itself as historically contingent. It comes out of Darwinian biology and this idea of the organism that develops over time and all that stuff that Foucault talks about in The Order of Things. And I think that itself, to me, is part, I don't know if you've read The Order of Things, but he talks about the analytic of finitude, the subject-object loop. And to me, that itself is that self-reflective, self-referential looping back. So life itself is just a reflection of the human. Yeah, that's how I see it. Thanks.
Sorry. I'm just getting a little bit nostalgic. This is my very first student ever, PhD student ever, who's now my colleague. Jill, I actually missed the last part, but I can say in the meantime, I could just say about the void of course thing. So it's a bit of it will get clearer in writing, but here is the thread. We can obviously see, I think that there are moments in this new geological time, and I didn't know about that they did not read. I didn't know that kind of ignoring anyways, that committee is still a thing. But I think that, to a certain extent, even if we were to not put a name on it, the fact that, our footprints will be legible, that we're leaving them on this planet, I don't think that it's something that we could easily discredit, right? So, all of this is it, that I think that there are different moments in this new in our current geological epoch, and the one that we are, and I think, talking about time, I think that there's also time is moving in a very odd way. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes you blink, it's 2028. So it's really strange, but I think that I say this because 10 years ago, the figure of the human, which is essentially at the center of the term itself, right, understood itself in a different way. It had its own kind of internal crisis, right? And the main crisis was actually a part of, some of the things that we've all talked about. And earlier today, the kind of geo-constructivist commitments, we messed it up, we have to fix it because this is our home, right? And suddenly, since our, I'll try to stop being sarcastic, but we do have a new kind of political regime that is not necessarily ignoring, back then people were, what was called conservatism was to deny the fact of climate crisis. Now, it's not a denial that we're actually looking, it's a strange coming to term with the realities of climate crisis by saying, oh yeah, no kidding, if you really want to know about this, Mary Jane Rubenstein, last book, Corporate, I love that book, Corporate Space Race, you see the language of conservatism. Trump even, the State of the Union, is that what you guys called it, the thing that happened last week? Yeah, so, he says part of the grand project that he's selling is, he said verbatim, we will put a flag, an American flag, on the moon. And, so, but he's first in command is absolutely aware of the nefarious condition that the planet itself is dealing with, and he has a solution. This place is done, guys. Let's get the hell out of here. There are other planets, Mars, etc. I mean, verbatim, I am going to let you die here because there's no future, right? So all of a sudden, what we have is it's a strange anthropos, one that's extraplanetary all of a sudden, and so inadvertently, a kind of like a different understanding of the human itself, but which, I didn't mean itself. I didn't mean it that way, but which is strange to me. So void, of course, is actually an astrological phrase, which, oh gosh, I won't go there. But anyways, it's the time when astrologically the moon, there's actually also an astronomical one, but I think that symbolically the astrological meaning of the phrase itself tries to get to where what I'm trying to say about humanism, or at least a uncritical endorsement of a figure which we think we know about. And I think that actually is not in Foucault, by the way. Men as a recent invention is actually the very first, let's say, the human, understand its, essential or fundamental fragmentation. It's like the first time that it actually just kind of scatters out and cannot put itself together because it's not a coherent figure in Foucault, right? So anyways, the void, of course, it's when the moon wanders, the moon changes sign every X number of days. And the void, of course, is when the moon is actually wandering. The word, and this is what I was looking up just to make sure that I remember. The word in Greek is kenodromia, which means running in emptiness, And for astrologers, there's a couple. It depends. It could be 2 hours, 2 days, or more, when the moon is actually has no major aspect or has not entered in the new sign, and it does that every 2 days or a little bit more. And astrologers actually do not. It's a moment of interruption and introspection where you cannot take up. It's about introspecting about. You cannot take up new projects, essentially. So what I'm saying in relation to the human, right? Maybe what we need is more. It's kind of like a suspension where we can think rather than coming up with new projects that assume they know what they mean with what we know what we mean by man or the human, etc. Maybe where we should stay, it's in that moment of introspection that might reveal something else. Does that make sense? So I'll just...
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Dixa.
Your discussion of void, of course, is, and I could be completely misunderstanding it, but it's just making me think of the dancers in the performance I was talking about who are just kind of listlessly that hasn't worked, and they're just listlessly walking about without doing anything, and it's a kind of state of suspended animation.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, in a sense. I'll answer the question about seduction because I get into that in my book, about how I was initially seduced by some of the language in Haraway's writing, the tendrils, the tentacles, and all this stuff, while at the same time feeling really uneasy. And then I realized that that unease is one that I feel, and it's not necessarily going to ward me away from something because I've always enjoyed horror film. And so I was reading it like it was horror, but it's not horror, right? It's a theory of how to be, or an attempt to understand how to better be in the world, which, is not doing the work of horror. So it's like, well, that's interesting. to realize. And so I delve into the initial seduction of that writing for me, and then a kind of like scales falling from my eyes as I read more closely and delved into that unease. With Alaward, actually, it was that aerial's ecology, because I was working on a now third book project that now is going to become maybe some other number because I'm working on another one. But it's a project of Black marronage and how the local environments and ecologies of the Caribbean were useful to African and indigenous groups throughout the Caribbean, right? And now I understand how much these ecologies for both the African groups and the indigenous Americas groups are so imbued with different realms, right? The tree is not just a tree, it might actually be like a way to get to the lower realms. But in that time, I wasn't thinking about things that way so much, only kind of. And so I was just reading whatever I could find on anybody writing about any ecology, anything, or like in the environment, nature, whatever word that I could get my hands on in relation to the Caribbean, which is not that many beyond the Caribbean writers themselves. And so I was interested in Ariel's ecology because it partly was thinking through some Caribbean texts. And as I discussed in This Will Not Be Generative, that book really ignited a sixth sense for me of like, no. Like, I actually I wrote a few pages, I had to close at it. I felt nausea that was very physical, very physical. So that wasn't as seductive for me, but it still nevertheless kind of was in that list of that kept growing of I'm just trying to understand this other thing I'm working through, and I keep encountering this kind of wall of why does blackness or black figuration or disfiguration, why does it keep coming up, or why does blackness not come up at all in the Americas context, right? Like, how is this not, even in discussions about colonialism, how? And then it was very interesting reading very, very carefully. I felt like it felt almost like sometimes close reading analysis, suspicious reading can really feel like you're a detective. So I was just reading everything that Haraway had written, and I found like a charting of, I was going to talk about this today, but no time. One of her important ideas, Children of the Compost, I found that in the late 80s she had written about the same concept, but in relation to where it first comes up, which is in Octavia Butler's work, and in relation specifically to forced pregnancy of a Black woman. So the Black woman falls off, Butler falls off, and then now the Children of the Compost involves, it's a speculative fabulation of how we may better be in the world that involves indigenous people none of whom are Black, in a kind of forging of a new humanity. And I found that really interesting, that it's not just that Blackness is not there, it's that it was there. And I found that particularly, so yeah, that section in the book is called From the Seduction to Recoil. And the final thing I'll say about this, the being outside, those of us who are in a position of being outside know, personally, I'm always very, very, very committed, not because it's like I decided to be politically, but I just can't be otherwise, committed to seeing how I am implicated. And so, for instance, even in this new work on mysticism and preparing for today, it's like, is more reality just like more entanglement? You know, and just really taking that question very seriously. And if it is, then why is this better than that, right? Like, and so I just feel that that's the only way I can be a scholar, is to think through, like, how am I don't want to critique something that I am implicated in some way, and maybe the critique can be there against me too, like, right? And I don't feel threatened by that, and I find it really important to my work.
I can briefly take up the question of seduction. I don't think that sort of critical negativity is the chastity or frigidity counterpart to seduction. And to return to Denise's opening remarks, I think that the affects of symptomatic reading are routinely misinterpreted or misidentified, as though symptomatic reading were necessarily cold or devoid of pleasure. So Stephen Swarbrick and I, when we wrote the Introduction to Negative Life, we wrote a section on seduction that's based on Laplanche, and what we gather from Laplanche is that seduction is an education in misdirection. And for Laplanche, seduction is really important to the Copernican revolution and to a proper extension of the Copernican revolution that was begun by Freud through the sort of arrival of the unconscious. So I would say that the problem with eco-criticism, which I'm fine with referring to in kind of monolithic terms, because there is a consensus, right? Like I still am an eco-critic, right? But there is a consensus in the field that is really overwhelming, that I observe, which could be called like the relational or pastoral consensus. So my problem is not that eco-criticism has been seduced by relation, it's that it hasn't taken seriously its seduction, and it has tried to disavow that seduction, and in doing so, it has yielded visions of the posthuman that are extraordinarily familiar, right? Like that are just like the human plus or the Enlightenment subject plus, and which is to say, like an enlightened subject that has taken a trip to like self-difference or indigeneity or blackness or sexual difference, and has been able to return bona fide and ameliorated, right? Like by that kind of encounter. And I think that without seduction, what we end up with, without a kind of ethics of seduction, what we end up with is a kind of theoretical tourism, right? So I would say, let us be seduced by relation, but it's not going to lead us to the version of relation that feels convenient and safe. It's going to lead us elsewhere, or mislead us elsewhere.
That is a fantastic place to leave us. I've got my eye on the time. I'd like to get us all to some food. Harper, I'm aware that your question hasn't been addressed yet, so you might want to take it to the speakers. Can I thank all you all for being here? These were 4 amazing papers, and to go back to Denise, your opening comments about conversation, overlapping conversations, overlapping questions, I feel we could sit here for another hour or two as these conversations are emerging. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next year.